Yeah. Good evening, everyone. Thanks again for joining us today for another webinar series, Deccan Birders. And today our speaker is uh, Mike Prince. Actually, Mike Prince is well known to most of our birders in terms of let it be eBird, let it be on migration, let it be his birding trips. I mean, many places. I mean, he's been taking us and he has guided the eBird community to a great extent. And sorry, just a second.
Audio.
Your audio is gone.
Hey, you're gone on mute.
Hello.
Yes.
Yeah, now better. I'm sorry. Yeah, I think I've gone on mute. So, yeah, again, coming back to Mike. So he's currently residing in Bangalore, but he is from the United Kingdom, and he has been here for a long time. And I mean, he is an expert in altitudinal migration in the Himalayas and is liable to be encountered as a straggler.
They don't
Might say vagrant, almost anywhere in India.
What do you want?
My name can be named.
Yeah.
Can you please mute?
Yeah.
Yeah. He has previously worked with the British Ornithology Trust and also Bird Count India, and Mike is known for his integrity, patience, and desire to help others. He has a unique perspective on India and its birds, having spent half of his adult life in our country. He also has an excellent sense of humor, without which he doesn't think he would have survived and enjoyed India for so long. I have personally known Mike through eBird, and it has been a great pleasure to understand and also look at eBird in a different perspective. So, guys, I don't want to just promote eBird and Boobo birding today, but I would say that's one place that those are two places where you wouldn't want to miss in this world of birding. So, over to Mike. Thank you, Mike, for agreeing and joining us today. Over to you.
Thank you very much for that very kind introduction. Let me just share my screen.
Shrikant, could you have the videos and the other things switched off, please? No disturbances now.
Yeah, we will have that.
Okay,
So everyone, please turn off your videos and we can have the speaker read.
Okay, can we see my screen okay?
Yes, please.
Okay, great. Yeah, so again, thank you very much for the kind introduction. As Shrikant said, then I've been in India half my adult life. I lived in Delhi for a couple of years and then Bangalore for the last nearly 15 years now. One thing I think fantastic about birding in India is that we have so much that we just don't know and don't understand yet. And the fact that even with me being based in Bangalore, which has got lots of birders here, most of my birding trips out, I try to go to places other people aren't going to. And you can find new places all the time. So in eBird terms, you can create a new hotspot. You can find somewhere where no one else has ever been before. And I think that's just a fantastic thing to be able to do. I certainly couldn't do that if I was back home in the UK, where I probably wouldn't be able to go out anywhere without meeting another birder, let alone finding a new place. Anyway, bird migration is something where clearly, globally, there's a lot we don't know. And when you look at India, there is a huge amount we don't know. Even on our common birds, we don't know some of the migration patterns for these. It's an interest I've always had. I think growing up in the UK as a kid, UK is lucky in that we have very visible migration. Birds in the summer are very different to the birds in the winter. If you live by the coast, you've got large flocks of waders, you can have seabirds passing, or you just have sort of passerines and swallows and things turning up on your local patch anywhere. So you see migration wherever you are. Now, therefore, I've always had that interest from it. I also was lucky enough to spend a year in Israel doing raptor migration surveys and other migration surveys. And I'll mention it briefly later, but Israel is a fantastic place globally, worldwide, for bird migration. So this particular talk, some of you may have heard, I did a talk a few months back for Delibird on bird migration. Tried to make this a little bit different, although there's a lot of common ground. So there's a little bit less background and theory in this one. For example, I won't mention Aristotle in this one, which I did in the previous one. And also one thing I wanted to do today, there was lots of mention of eBird there as well, is to see how you can use eBird to try and understand some patterns with our birds. So I'm going to look at quite a few species that we know very well and see what eBird can tell us about their migration patterns. Okay, so bird migration. Okay. We know that there's tens of billions of birds every year that migrate, migrating many thousands of miles, and it really is a miracle that everyone has been fascinated by. We know some of the stories of the real exciting migrations, like the Arctic tern. Unfortunately, not a bird we get to see in India, but it flies around the Earth every year, in effect, from Arctic to Antarctic. So it is the longest travelled of any migrant. But then we have got things we're a little bit more familiar with. Bar-tailed godwit. If we're on the coast, not an uncommon bird in the winter. It's been known to fly nearly 12,000 kilometres in one go. I'll talk about bar-tailed godwit later, but it's just an incredible feat. And then things that we don't actually have here, unfortunately, but ruby-throated hummingbird, pictured there in the bottom left, weighs 3 grams. It's one of the lightest birds in the world. And yet this migrates every year across the Gulf of Mexico into Florida. And that's a 1,000-kilometre journey, 1,000 kilometres over water for a 3-gram bird. Okay, and a familiar species, barn swallow. So barn swallow will fly 10,000 kilometres on its migration, and most of them return to the exact same sites they bred in the previous year, even the same nest. So how on earth do they manage to find that? So what actually is migration? Well, it's actually a bit complex really, but in a simple terms, it's birds moving from one area to another for some reason. The word migration actually means to change or to go away. When we talk about migration, I mean, there's the obvious migration that we think of, the ones I've given some examples of there, but there are other forms of migration, which I'll talk about. One thing we do tend to exclude when you talk about migration, though, is daily movements. There may be a movement from one place to another place with a purpose, such as going to a roosting area or a feeding site. But when it's within one day, typically those are excluded from migrations. Why are birds migrating? In a nutshell, it's to enhance their chances of survival. So they're moving to areas where their survival is better, where the resources they need to survive are higher. Now, what we typically think of there is food and nesting locations. So they're moving for better feeding opportunities, better nesting opportunities, and those two combined should mean better survival. Few definitions before we start. A migrant, fairly obvious, a bird that migrates, and the opposite that is a resident bird, or sometimes called a sedentary bird. So when we talk about a summer migrant, we're talking about a bird that visits for the summer its breeding grounds. So it goes somewhere for the northern hemisphere summer, typically. Now, the timings is something interesting. I'll talk about it a little bit because in India, our timings are not so obvious. Well, our seasons are not as well defined as they would be in Europe, for example. We've more or less got 4 seasons of 3 months long. And our breeding seasons for birds are more spread out through the year. Particularly, you've got birds that wait for the monsoon to breed or wait post-monsoon when there's lots of insects around to breed. So you've got a much longer spread. So it's maybe not so obvious when birds are migrating. Winter migrant, opposite summer migrant, obviously, a bird that visits the winter. And where we are in India, most of what we're seeing are winter migrants, birds that are spending their summers further north and coming here for the lovely mild winters that I did many years ago, but I stayed. We also have passage migrants. So those are birds that don't stop in an area, they pass through. And I'll look at quite a few passage migrants later. When we talk about migration, you'll hear the terms outward and return migration defined a bit. Outward migration, which gets a bit confused sometimes, it tends to be it's the journey after breeding. So if you assume breeding is the bird's main home, then they're going outward after breeding, and then they return to come back to breed. It gets a bit confusing when we're in somewhere like India, where most of our birds are winter birds. We tend to think of us as being their home. But when I'm talking about migration, we really mean their breeding grounds are their home. And a term that gets very confused in India, and I didn't realize this one got confused until I came here actually, over summering. So sometimes birds don't migrate and they'll remain. Let's assume, if we're talking India, for example, a bird has spent the winter here and it remains, doesn't migrate in the spring, it stays here in the summer. That's over summering. In India, for some reason, people tend to think the other way around, and they think that's overwintering, meaning it's stayed over the winter, past the winter. But it's not, it's over summering. And you see that in some waders, some ducks, for example, often injured birds that decide not to make the journey. So you might find a shoveler in June, for example, on your local lake, and sometimes immature birds as well. Not all birds breed until they're sort of 2 or 3 years old, and some will remain on their wintering grounds. In particular, so quite a lot of seabirds like that. So skuas that we see in India, we can see skuas in the June, July, August sometimes, and those tend to be immature birds that haven't migrated. And therefore overwintering is the opposite, bird that remains on its breeding areas or passage areas during the winter. That's often the case with vagrants. So if you find a bird that's turned up out of place somewhere, maybe it doesn't continue its migratory journey, it's got lost, it might stay on. And I think there's a number of cases where, for example, in India, you might find a bird turns up out of range in the autumn and then stays for a few months. It's overwintering instead of trying to winter here. There's a couple of points that are quite interesting on when we talk about outward migration. Remember that young birds, for example, have never done this journey before. So this is the first time. They don't know their wintering grounds. So that's one thing that makes migration just a pretty amazing feat. So when we talk about migration, the main migration we think of is this seasonal round-trip migration. This is what we think of. It's birds wintering in the south, at least I'm sort of assuming northern hemisphere on here. So they're wintering in the south, they're going to breeding grounds in the north. Often they use the same site, same breeding grounds, same wintering grounds, and we talk about site fidelity for birds that return to the same place. Now they might not always take the same routes. In spring they'll go a different way to the autumn. That's quite common in lots of birds, and we'll see some examples of that later. That's known as loop migration. And that will be, the routes are better because of, for example, feeding en route might be easier. And we'll go into that a little bit later. Directions of migration are typically north or south, so it's latitudinal migration. But there are some oddities with birds that go west to east. And actually from the examples you see within the subcontinent, we get a lot of birds that probably move from sort of northwest to southeast. So birds that are summering in Europe but are coming southeast to the subcontinent rather than going south to Africa, which you might expect. And there are distances of migration. I mean, not all birds do Arctic terns or Bartow godwits. So we have a lot of birds that are short distance migrants as well. So that was the main type of migration we think of, but there are various other types. And I'll try not to go into too much detail here because it's too complicated and I certainly am no expert in it. Altitudinal migration is one we have, and this one we are actually quite familiar with, quite a lot of it in India, obviously, because we are lucky that we have a great altitudinal range. It's similar, really, to a standard seasonal migration, but instead of birds moving in latitude, they're moving in altitude. Wall creeper is a super example. So this is breeding as high as 6,300 meters in the Himalayas. Clearly, harsh weather conditions in the winter make it very difficult for them to find food, and so they come down. Now they'll come down to, if you're lucky enough to be in the northern plains, so places around Corbett, for example, Kosi River and places like that, you might well find wall creepers that are now at like very low altitudes, 100 meters, that sort of altitude even. Now they might have only traveled 100 kilometers from the areas that they've spent the summer, but they might well have come down 6 kilometers. So there's a lot of altitudinal migrants, and this is one area I think which is not necessarily that well studied because it needs accurate record taking of where you're actually seeing birds. If you're birding in the Himalayas, where you are altitude-wise is extremely relevant. Since eBird was introduced quite a bit, I'll drop my little bit of eBird in, but if you are birding and you're spending a day in the Himalayas, you can quite easily move, say, 2,000 meters in altitude if you're doing things by car. And the bird life can differ drastically. So it's very interesting and key there to very accurate lists for the place you actually are each time, because your altitude might have changed a lot and the birds might have changed a lot. Some unusual altitudinal migrants. Some of the pheasants are altitudinal migrants. They might go very short distance, 1,000 meters or so, but it can be dramatically different in weather conditions and hence food conditions. Other examples in the north would be things like brown dippers and spotted forktail. One that we see most of India, which is an altitudinal migrant, is grey wagtail. So grey wagtails breed in India, breed in the higher Himalayas, and winter pretty much everywhere. Grey wagtail is also a fantastic example of site fidelity. So they will come back to the exact same places year after year. And there was quite a famous one a few years ago at Bihar Hills in Karnataka, which was a grey wagtail that only had 1 foot. And so because of that, it could be recognized easily. And that came to the exact same wintering area at least 3 years running, may have been longer. So that's one thing when you think, if you're seeing your Blythe's reed warbler in your garden this winter, there's a good chance it was actually the same one that you saw last winter. Partial migration is where certain individuals in a population migrate, but some don't. Some are resident. And actually there's quite a lot of species that are like this for different populations. Again, probably not very well understood, and we don't really know because it gets complicated if some birds are migrating, some aren't. Pied cuckoo would be one example. We'll talk about that later, but some pied cuckoos seem to be resident in India. Some are quite long-distance migrants. But others that do exhibit some form of partial migration include great cormorants. You'll see great cormorants on rather unclear movements sometimes. Last year in February in Uttarakhand, 2 or 3 times I saw a flock in the sort of Dehradun area, for example, going over at about 2,000 meters or so. A flock of 100 cormorants going somewhere. Where are they going? Not all cormorants do that. They're a partial migrant, but we don't know much about their movements. It's also the fact that some of these partial migrants might be breeding in the same areas, and you can't tell the difference. You look at the bird, you can't tell the difference, but they're moving into different populations. And in fact, some people would consider that partial migration is actually a sort of evolutionary crossroads, as over time, one strategy is probably more beneficial than the other one, so more of the birds might start to migrate or might remain resident. But at the moment, they're in that mixed position of it's unclear which strategy is more successful. Differential migration is an interesting one, and one where everyone's observations can help a bit. It's where within a single species, not all birds migrate together or to the same places or at the same times. Now that, when we say not all birds, adults and immatures, for example, might have different migratory behaviors. Males and females often have different migratory behaviors. So some examples there, ducks is quite common that you'll find immatures moving further, females moving further than males sometimes. Harriers, marsh harriers, typically tend to see more females or immatures than males in many places. So this is all differential migration. And so for ducks, for example, it will be quite interesting to keep a note on the sexes of ducks in flocks during the winter. Are there more males compared to females, or the other way around? And we also know that some ducks, I'll talk about gardening a little bit later, do tend to migrate separately. Males migrate earlier than females, for example. Okay. Moult migration. So this is another type of migration, a bit different. So most birds generally molt their feathers in advance of some major activity that takes lots of energy in their life. So breeding is one. Migration is obviously another one. They want to have fresh feathers before migration. So a lot of birds will molt before migration, most small birds, for example. But a lot of birds, such as some wildfowl, some seabirds, go somewhere specifically to molt. And this is not necessarily a place that's on their normal migration route, but it's known as a molt migration. The best example would be shelduck, common shelduck in particular, a rarer bird in India, but in Europe is a very famous Moult migrant, where about 100,000 or so from across northwest Europe all congregate in what's called the Wadden of Germany, and spend a few months there molting. Now, birds that do tend to do a molt migration will often lose all their flight feathers at one time, so they're actually flightless for a few weeks until they replace them. So because of that, the sites that they're choosing have to be extremely safe and have very good food supplies. So things like that are key for conservation. So that's a vital area to conserve. So in India, I'm not too sure what we have as molt migrants, whether they have particular molt migration sites. Ruddy shelduck is one that does have a molt migration, but common coot is known to have a molt migration in various places. So it will be interesting to know whether there are peaks in numbers at certain sites in India after breeding for some of these birds. Okay, another type of dispersal, a type of migration, not always thought of as true migration really, but is dispersal. So having bred, young birds tend to not stay in the same territory as their parents, and they usually wander around for a while. This is why you hear it referred to as post-juvenile dispersal again. So resident species are the commonest ones. Again, I'm not entirely sure what are the best examples in India, but there is one form of dispersal that we do see a little bit, which is monsoon dispersal. So birds that are moving post or during the monsoons. I mentioned a few here, but crimson-back sunbird is an interesting one because we get to see that close to Bangalore. It's not here, it's in the Western Ghats only, most of the year, but July, August, maybe into September, most years we have a few reports around in some of the hills around Bangalore, and then never at any other time. So there's a clear happening every year monsoon dispersal there. And there's a few other birds that we get in this area that I noticed do a similar thing. So brown-backed needletails tend to be reported from areas away from the Ghats, Malabo sling thrush as well. So these are all monsoon dispersals. I'm sure in parts of the rest of the country we also have birds that move around post-monsoon a little bit. I mentioned that it's not really, sometimes not considered migration, but if you think of what I said about migration being a movement from one area to another area with a specific purpose, then it very clearly is. But it only happens typically once in a bird's life, so it's in the juvenile stage. But it's quite predictable. Okay. A couple of exciting migrations. Nomadic migration is one that you don't see very often, but these are birds that make a one-way movement and then they settle in that new area and breed there. They don't go back to where they came from. Hence, this is why I discussed it. I could be considered a nomadic migrant. It tends to be unpredictable. So food availability forces them to move, for example. And it not necessarily in a consistent direction. It might be different from one year to the next time it happens several years later. There aren't too many good examples in Europe and Asia. Red crossbill is a very well-known one. I'm not sure, again, on the impacts in India. It's not a common bird here, obviously. I've never seen one. But in Europe, it feeds exclusively on spruce, which is not a very predictable crop. Some years it's widespread, there's a lot of food. Some years there aren't. So they migrate and they'll stay on and they'll breed in odd places. And interesting enough, they can breed when they're very young. So even juvenile plumage birds are known to breed. So they just take advantage when the conditions are right. And they move and breed. So desert species are ones that there are quite a few nomads. Anything in Australia, budgerigar is one of them. But these are following flowering blossoms, flowering other flowering plants that are not predictable. One we do have, or had a few years ago, is pale rock sparrow, which is the bird pictured. Now, pale rock sparrows are usually in sort of Eastern Europe, Middle East. They're known to be nomads. And in 2012, it was, in Kutch in particular, there were a number of flocks even of sort of 200 or 300 birds that turned up. And this is the first time they've been recorded in India. Now, they didn't stay on to breed, and there have been one or two birds seen since then, but not many. That was it. So Maybe it's not quite a nomadic migration in this case because they did seemingly return to the original areas rather than breed here. But it could be considered more of an irruption, which is similar type of migration. This is again away from the normal range of the species, but this is where birds don't normally breed. They'll normally return to their usual breeding sites. But this is not a migration that happens every year. So similar to the nomadic migration, it's dependent on food. It might be dependent on breeding success, weather also. So normally, in a normal year, some years might have poor food supply, but generally populations will be reasonably stable. But there might be some period where there's maybe there's a high population of birds that's built up over a few years, and then suddenly there's low food supply, and that has a knock-on effect, and the birds end up erupting to some other areas. Typically very unpredictable and exciting if you're a bird watcher. So there are some well-known species that erupt unpredictably every few years. Nutcrackers is one that they turn up in Europe, even though they're really Central Asian birds mostly. There's the dream bird for most European birders, which is Pallas's sandgrouse, which hasn't erupted, I think, for probably 50 years, but has done occasionally in the past. One we probably see in India a little bit is short-eared owl. So short-eared owls, most owls that are like breed far north, can be very dependent on the supply of lemmings, which go through their population cycles every 4 years typically. So every 4 years there's a crash in lemming populations and the owls are forced to move. So it would be interesting, we get short-eared owls right down to the southern tip of India, but it would be interesting to see whether in better years for short-eared owls that corresponds with poor years for lemmings and voles in sort of Arctic Scandinavia and across the taiga and that sort of areas. Waxwing is a famous erupting migrant that one or two people were lucky enough to see in Himachal Pradesh just a few years ago. First records for about 100 years in India. And waxwings turn up in Europe much more regularly, and they're fantastic birds, so they're really popular, but it's again every few years. And the Indian sighting, which I think was 3 years ago, something like that, did correspond with a waxwing year in Europe. So birds were definitely on the move. So that's a little bit about the different types of migration, but why do birds migrate? It's an incredible feat. It's obviously incredibly risky. They must do it for a reason. Well, quite simply, the reason is to enhance their chances of survival. And I talked about that food availability and nesting availability. Now, this animation, which was put together by Madhu, I think is fascinating because this is showing how longer daylight hours leads to a greening of the land, if you see what I mean. And you can just see how extensive areas are that are not available to birds in the winter. But the whole belt through Central Asia, through Siberia, through the taiga and tundra zones, it's a vast area. The longer daylight means much more time for foraging. The natural food is plentiful, so you've got much more plant growth. You've got an abundance of insects. You've got seeds and fruits and things. You've also got just more area, some more nesting locations. The further north you go, relatively predator-free. So there's lots of ground nesting birds in the taiga and the Arctic, and ground nesting birds here have a lot of predators, whether it be feral dogs or all sorts of mammals. But where you go furthest north, the odd roaming polar bear or wolverine or something like that, but generally a lot less ground predators. So one of the things I noticed that has been studied is noticed that you've got nearly 24-hour daylight if you go as far north as you can, and birds can be foraging completely around the clock. And studies have shown how they'll raise more young with the extra foraging time they have. So that's one of the reasons they'll decide to migrate. And as I mentioned, most birds are migrating north when we're in the northern hemisphere, through to all this lovely land that suddenly appears. But as it comes towards winter, daylight shortens, insect life becomes scarce, So birds have to move back down south. So if you got to do this journey every year, and you can survive in the winter where you are because there's food there, why not just stay there? Seems a bit of a hassle. It's like a few tens of thousands of kilometers for a bit of food and a bit of nesting, and then back again. So it's a good question, actually. Birds survive in the winter. However, in the breeding season, they're feeding young. There's much higher demand on food. So food supply would be a problem if all the birds stayed where they were. Also, nest sites would be a problem. Predators would presumably be concentrated. The bird populations are highest, be more predators there. Clearly, actually, another thing, more birds there are in close space, more chance of disease and parasites through. So there are good reasons for migrating rather than staying where you are. But it's an incredibly risky business. So clearly exhaustion, if you think of these journeys, is a major problem. Birds have to feed up really well to be able to survive these journeys. If they can't get enough food, then they'll struggle. They can overheat. Unexpected weather conditions will cause problems. Starvation is a major one. And then we'll talk about this again coming forward a little bit more, but habitat loss in areas can decimate the food supply in a place where these birds are migrating, stopping, planning to refuel, and then if that habitat's gone, they've had it. Collisions are actually a major issue. So collisions with buildings, birds getting disoriented by artificial lights of cities. And I think there's, in the US, there's been stats that have said, not just for migrants, but birds overall, that about 1 billion birds die per year through collisions. Clearly there's predators around. Now, actually, one of the worst predators is the feral cats. And the fact they kill many more, I think a couple of billion birds in the US are killed by cats. Again, not all migrants, but migrants are very susceptible. They turn up exhausted, relatively easy prey. Disease can be a problem. Quite a topical one actually at the moment, because you think this is lots of birds traveling together. They're not social distancing. There is a risk of disease spreading through populations. Weather I mentioned a little bit, but birds can easily be thrown off by unexpected weather. Extra cloud, fog, rain can affect them. Hunting is unfortunately a major problem. So throughout Mediterranean Europe, you hear of things of Malta, Cyprus, Lebanon, in particularly horrendous places where millions of birds are unlawfully killed every year. Clearly in Asia we have quite a problem with poaching and hunting. You've got species such as yellow-breasted bunting, which was abundant in China, northeast India, certainly in huge flocks. And in recent years that's been upgraded to critically endangered by the IUCN, with its populations brought down to really severe levels purely through hunting, or majorly through hunting, some also through habitat loss. So it's interesting that you think of all these risks and the difficult journey, but migration as a strategy has been around for a long time. Birds do it. It must work, otherwise they wouldn't be doing it. But as I was sort of going through these list of challenges, I was thinking what's quite shocking about this really is that how many of these are either direct or indirectly impacted by man. And almost all of them are. Clearly the things like hunting and poaching, which directly are, but habitat loss is the major one here. And habitat loss and development are probably the major causes then for the exhaustion, the starvation of birds. So, they know about why they migrate. It's a risky business. How do they do it? And I think this is where the really interesting things come in, because there's a lot we don't know about how they do it. One thing that is fairly well studied and known, and you can observe this yourself, is that prior to migration, birds need to prepare for it. They can't just set off one day on these long journeys. Much as we prepare for a long journey, we'd fuel up, put a full tank of petrol in the car. We'd pack some snacks, so we've got lots of food for the way in case we don't stop and get some food. So birds are actually doing quite a similar thing. Firstly, before we come to that, when do they know? Do they know when to migrate? And this is known to be pretty much instinctive for when birds are starting to migrate, but when they're also doing the other sort of main events in their annual cycle. So when should they molt? When should they start to breed? When do they migrate? And these are known to be generally instinctive, but one of the triggers, the key trigger for them, is a change in day length. So the change in day length, more than the actual weather at the time, for example, birds can detect the change in day length, and that's used as a trigger for hormonal changes that they need as well to prepare for the migration. I mentioned molt a little bit before. So most birds, most migrants that is, will have a major molt before they migrate. And this will take a few weeks. And the molt itself takes quite a lot of energy, not just the migration. So you can see in places birds before they depart will often be very actively feeding to try and put on extra body weight, extra fat. There's a term for this, hyperphagia, which is the active feeding of birds. And I haven't noticed it so much in India, to be honest, but in Europe you see a lot, certainly see a lot with warblers and thrushes feeding very actively before the migration. This picture here is of a lesser whitethroat, and you see it's on a blackberry bush. And that's one thing, a lot of birds, like warblers, like this lesser whitethroat, is an insect eater typically, but prior to migration will shift its diet more to fruit and fruits and berries, which will give them more energy. The other thing just before departure is that birds are noticed being sort of quite restless. And there's a term for the German term called the Suchenruhe, which is known as this migratory restless that you can see just before birds depart. And you can see, again, I mean, smaller passerines, but you can also probably see if you're at a wetland somewhere, for example, a flock of terns, you sometimes see them suddenly flying up quite high, and it's almost like they're sussing out, should we be going now or not? And then you may be lucky and actually see them do that and fly up quite high quite quickly, and off they go. The actual top point of departure probably is where the weather comes in, so they're going to wait for favourable conditions to when they actually leave. We're talking about extra energy here. So some birds are known to lose about 1% of their body weight in 1 hour's migratory flight. So if you think that they are losing sort of 10% or more of their body weight every single day on migration, it's a huge amount of energy they need, and therefore they need to be refueling as much as they can. So how do they get there? How do they know where they're going when they get there? This is really I suppose the miracle of migration. Now there's two aspects really to them finding their way: orientation and navigation. And orientation is, if you like, the rough one. It's like, where am I and which direction should I go in? It doesn't need to be quite so accurate here. I know that I need to head roughly south. It's a little bit like using a compass to set off. And then there's navigation, which is the more accurate one. This is where we would use our map or our Google Maps or something to know the exact place we're going to. So clearly we've got in the right direction, but how do I actually get back to that same nice wintering feeding area that I used last year? Now, studies have shown there's quite a lot of information that scientists know from various studies, field studies and laboratory studies about orientation, but actually relatively little about navigation. And there are some fantastic feats we know of, and there's some of these experiments of taking birds away from their natural area. So it's been done, there's a famous study done with Manx shearwaters, which are a seabird that breeds on islands off Britain and Ireland, for example, and taken to North America, USA, and released. And they more or less all found their way back to their breeding sites. So it's pretty amazing how birds manage to do this. So how do they manage the orientation? So this is the little bit that we do know a little bit about. So for a start, we know that birds, clearly they know which way to go, or roughly which way to go. We don't see birds migrating in the wrong direction, particularly. Now, there's a lot of captive bird experiments that have been done to see how birds migrate or how they can migrate. There was one quite famous one done many years ago with garden warblers, which is a Sylvia warbler, a little bit like a lesser whitethroat from Europe and West Asia. And there were some garden warblers that were hand reared, and they were well fed, and they were kept in cages. And when it came to the normal natural migration time, both in autumn and spring, they would orientate themselves within the cage in the direction that they were supposed to migrate, head over to the right corner of the cage, for example. And interestingly, even more than that, not many birds necessarily take an absolute straight line on their migration. And these garden warblers, sort of halfway through the normal natural period of their journey, would change their direction a little bit, would orientate in a different way. So they have this instinct. There's clearly an instinct there. But there's more to it than that. So how else can they orient? Well, the sun. It's quite easy to tell your orientation and orient yourself according to the sun. We know that if you're in the northern hemisphere, it rises in the east, sets in the west, it's at its highest at noon. But to do that, you need to know the time as well. So if birds are to use the sun, they actually have to have some kind of internal clock. And again, there's been experiments done on birds in cages here, where they've been denied visibility of the sun, and then when they provided the sun, they provided it in the wrong place, for example. And they would orient themselves according to the artificial sun, which might be in the wrong direction. So clearly the sun is used as a way to orient themselves, but it's often cloudy, so that wouldn't work all the time. And most birds we know actually migrate at night, so it can't all be the sun. So if birds are migrating at night, do they use the stars? And again, experiments on birds in captivity, caged birds, have shown that they do use the stars. The experiments have been done with birds effectively in a planetarium, where you could shift the alignment of stars. And it's known the birds would recognize stars rotating around a bright spot. So they don't necessarily recognize every constellation, but they'll see this rotation around, so they'll recognize where north is, for example. And some of these studies have proven that young birds sort of learn this. So this is not necessarily entirely instinctive. They actually learn the positions, which I don't know, I haven't looked at this here, but it gives you the impression of birds sort of just out of the nest, sort of waking up in the night and just looking up at the sky and working out where things are, so that they know when they're going to migrate in a week or two. Okay, so stars, they do use the stars, but again, that's not the end of the matter, because what about cloudy nights when they can't see the stars? They manage to migrate okay then, most of the time. So it comes down to magnetic fields. And this is one of the interesting ones. Humans can't sense the Earth's magnetic field, but we know that birds can, and they can detect the magnetic field lines and their inclination, their angle of inclination. So they can position themselves and know where they are roughly due to the magnetic field. And this is really is a bit of a mystery. Some of this is known how they do it, and there's certain adaptations in the brain, I think, that believed to detect magnetic fields, but it's really not understood very well how they do this. But one thing most scientists are fairly sure about is that it's probably the most reliable of all their compasses. So they have some instinct for it. They'll use the sun, they'll use the stars, but most birds probably rely on magnetic fields as the main way to orient themselves. So what about navigation then? So this is finding the exact location. I mentioned swallows earlier, barn swallows returning to the same nest. There was one study done in the UK on barn swallows that amongst their sample size, 44% of the barn swallows returned to the very same nest the following year. So it's not just the same area, the same village, same farm, it's the very same nest they used 1 year later. So how do they manage to do that? Well, not known very well, but they do this every year. So they might learn it. They might be able to remember a map And clearly they can to some extent. Birds can recognize rivers, coastlines, mountain ranges, and use these to guide them on their way. Even roads are known. So this is known with homing pigeons who will follow roads and take turns in the road when the road bends, even if it's not the most direct route sometimes. So they do recognize landmarks. But even so, that doesn't really, it's a bit much to think they can recognize the entire map down to a small scale and find their own nest. But and also, one question would be, well, what about young birds that have not done this before? They can't remember a journey they've never done before. And not all young birds migrate with their parents. So there's got to be more to it than that. So one of the areas of thinking is that the magnetic field that birds can detect and can use for orientation, maybe they can actually effectively determine their location, like a latitude and longitude, based on the intensities of the magnetic fields, and work out roughly where they are on Earth. So this is really, I think, the biggest mystery of migration, even with all the studies have done, that we really still don't know the answers to how birds find like a small location that way. So their actual journey that they have to do. I mentioned briefly the Arctic tern. I won't talk any more about that one because we don't get them in India, but please do have a look it up. It's the most fascinating one, and there are many good studies with birds that have been tagged with geolocators. Bartel Godwit I'll mention in a bit. So those two are the big distance record holders. Most birds do this journey in stages, so they don't all do it like the Bartel Godwit, which does its 12,000 kilometers in one go. Most birds stop in various places for refueling, and that becomes a real key thing for conservation, these staging sites. Some of them might be well-known, obvious sites, but many are not really. So any habitat destruction could have an impact on migratory birds there. Actually, I should have mentioned also that when I talk about distance here, this is long distance, but short distance, there are birds that still, you can call it a migration, but some grouse and pheasants might just go a few hundred meters, and that's it. They'll go to the coniferous forest to a deciduous forest not far away. That could be all they do, but it's still a migration. There's also an interesting long migration, which is the Adelaide penguin. So Adelaide penguins migrate. I think they've been known to do something like 10,000 or more kilometers per year migration. So it's a really significant distance. And of course, it's walking. So they walk along the ice to find the open sea, and they'll do this journey every year. So it's still a migration. So not all birds fly on their migration. When they're flying, how fast do they go? One of the points I think about speed is it's not actually that important to birds, much like it isn't to humans. It doesn't really matter how fast you get there. It matters that you get there safely and in one piece. So the speeds typically birds fly at is much like we might go on a journey in a car. And interestingly, swifts are not nearly the fastest. The waders and ducks are the fastest typically. And you can see that if you watch flocks of ducks flying, they really are pretty quick. But you can see that ducks and waders are obviously spending a lot of energy doing that. One other aspect of speed would be in terms of timings generally. And the migrations in autumn especially are particularly slow. Birds will take quite a long time from the time they leave the breeding grounds to the time they arrive. They haven't got the urge that they might have in the spring. In the spring, they're driven by the need to breed. They'll migrate more directly, typically, and faster. So in the autumn, barn swallows, for example, are known to take a few months. Marsh warblers apparently have been known to take about 6 months from their breeding grounds to their wintering grounds. So there is that does lead to one interesting thing for us bird watchers, in that if someone reports a particularly rare species in your area, and you fancy going to see it, if it's the spring, I'd probably advise going as soon as you can. The bird's not going to stay around very long. In the autumn, you might have a chance. It might wait for a while and feed for a while and be there a few days later. And in the spring, in fact, you can often find birds that just drop in some site for minutes or a few hours and are then gone. Terns would be a good example. In India, so whiskered terns, white-winged terns, in the end of April or early May, a flock might drop into a local reservoir, spend a few minutes, and then be gone again. So a little bit more about the journey. Now, everyone's heard this, bar-headed geese flying over Mount Everest. It would be lovely to think it's true, but it's almost certainly not true. Whilst birds have been recorded at over 8,000 meters as hooper swans, it's not really on migration. It's in severe weather or weather-driven movement. Generally, birds, so on sea crossings, they'll fly quite high, 8,000 meters, but most birds, in particular small birds, are migrating very low. I'll talk about the bar-headed geese when I come on to the species a little bit later, but most small passerines that you see are migrating sort of 400 meters or so. Raptors and things like that might be a kilometre or more up, but generally I don't think there's many birds who are actually going over the top of the mountains. So most birds migrate at night, and it makes some sense. You can imagine that yes, they're not going to overheat so easily or get dehydrated. The air is cooler, it's denser, it's less windy typically. There are probably fewer predators around at night, so it's easier. And these are not nocturnal birds we're talking about, so it must be advantageous for birds to migrate at night generally. So there's a couple of useful exercises you can try here. There's a fun one that I haven't tried in India. I'm not sure whether it works so well, but try some moon watching. Now, this in areas that get a lot of migration. I did this in Israel quite a few times. If you've got a night where there's a large moon, it's quite clear. If you, particularly with a telescope, if you can sit with a telescope and point your telescope at the moon, every few seconds maybe, you might notice suddenly a dot whizzes across the moon. And that's a bird migrating. And now you're not going to be able to identify it. Sometimes you might get a clue whether it was a wader or it was a thrush or something like that. But you can actually see this. And I can remember doing one occasion where every few seconds there were birds passing the moon in Israel as was. And if you start to think of what a narrow area of the sky you're looking at through a telescope at the moon filling your view, and you try and extrapolate that, you can really see that there are thousands of birds moving at the time. Another one which is more interesting, and we should be trying this in India, is it's known as knock-migging, nocturnal migration watching, or listening. So this has become really popular in lots of places in Europe and the US in recent years, and actually been especially so in lockdown when people weren't traveling. But most of these birds migrate by night, and they call quite regularly at night. So plenty of places, people, even in their city houses, city apartments or things, have left out some recording device on their balcony or in their garden, something overnight, and tried to pick up any sounds of birds migrating. And it's amazing what sounds people have been finding, and there'll be lots of them in Europe and in the city centres and things. Will be things like birds you wouldn't expect, so grey heron, moorhens, coots, water rails, certain species that were thought of as quite rare birds, which turn up in much larger numbers. Ortolund bunting is one in parts of Britain that's really, really rare as a migrant, but actually has been heard in plenty of places going over at night. So this is something I might try, actually, but now we're just about reaching our autumn migration season, is if you've got some digital recorder, and maybe even your phone, is to leave it outside and see if you can pick up any calls. It's a bit tricky because obviously they're quite faint. There's lots of other noise around, but it's an interesting area of study that people are just picking up now. Okay, migrating by day. So obviously this is the more visible migration that we're seeing. Not all birds migrate by day, but the ones that do are things like swallows and swifts. We see a lot, and presumably that's because they can feed en route. They feed in flight. They can catch insects. It makes sense for them. larks and finches are common diurnal migrants. I don't really know why they should be, particularly why don't they migrate at night. Not sure if that is generally known. The most, not necessarily the most obvious ones, but the most spectacular ones would be the large birds. And these are soaring birds in particular, so raptors, storks and pelicans. And these are birds that use thermals. So they use columns of warm air that rise up off the land, gain height from those, and then most of their flight is gliding and taking up minimal energy. And so this is what can lead to some really spectacular numbers. These are European honey buzzards in this picture in Georgia, in a place called Batumi, which is a raptor bottleneck, much like Israel, where I was. The other thing, birds migrating, most birds don't migrate in flocks, actually, or in the same groups. So whilst you may see family groups of things like geese quite commonly, most small birds aren't migrating in similar groups. Okay, so on to where. Where can you see birds migrating? Well, actually, you can see birds migrating anywhere, but most birds migrate in what you call a broad front. So there aren't necessarily any particular places they're migrating. They're in a wide band across the landscape. But you get areas where these get funneled. And that we talk about being a narrow front migration rather than a broad front. And that's particularly the things I just mentioned, the large storks, pelicans that are looking for thermals. They can't fly very easily over water. There's no thermals develop over water. They have to flap all the time. They use a lot of energy. So they'll take routes that will go round water barriers. And this is where you get the real spectacular diurnal migrations. So I mentioned Israel. Israel is at the junction of Europe, Asia, and Africa, at the eastern end of the Mediterranean. So birds are getting funneled around the Mediterranean through all the birds, pretty much most of the birds that are breeding in Central Asia and wintering in Africa need to come through Israel. And so you get some phenomenal numbers, hundreds of thousands of honey buzzards, Levant sparrowhawks, lesser spotted eagles. So the lesser spotted eagle is an interesting one. The species that we used to have in India before people realized that what we see here isn't actually that close to lesser spotted eagle, and it was split, and hence we have Indian spotted eagle now. But the true lesser spotted eagle, which is an Eastern European breeder, all the population migrates through Israel. And when I was in Israel, I was doing raptor migration counts, but a few years before I was there, the count in the autumn, I'm not sure what the numbers were. It would have been something like 70, 80, 90,000 lesser spotted eagles or something like that. But whatever it was, the count in a single autumn was considerably higher than the known global population. So the population estimates were obviously wrong because more birds came through Israel in one autumn. So clearly these are some of the spectacular places. Unfortunately, I'm yet to work out where in India we get these real spectacular migrations. I'm sure we do, maybe not to that extent, but there'll be passes in the Himalayas, for example. There'll be coastal areas that get numbers through. I don't think we really know yet, but there are undoubtedly areas where you can get sudden large numbers of birds coming through on a particular route. Most birds, though, are on this broad front that I talked about. But you will hear the term flyway used quite a lot. And this is a concept that's come from BirdLife International, talking about the sort of the main broad ranges that birds tend to migrate along. Now, it's not a precise thing. It's not, birds don't exactly follow this route. Birds will cross over routes. But it's quite a useful exercise, mostly to try and help identify sites that are important to conserve on these routes, and also bring together organizations from different parts of these ranges. So NGOs on the ground, governments that can help conserve some of these areas where we're connected by the birds. So there are 8 major migratory flyways that BirdLife International have sort of defined. Unfortunately, we're probably on the least spectacular one, being on the Central Asian flyway. but we don't quite have the real spectacular numbers that the American Pacific American flyway would have through Panama, for example, which funnels large numbers of raptors. We don't quite have the huge wetlands of the East Asian, Australasian flyway that are major staging areas. Most of our birds come on a broader front along the Central Asian flyway. But we can see even this broad front, we do still have sort of two main routes within this because the problem birds have migrating from Central Asia to India is the Himalayas. So there are funneling of birds on the west side through the Indus Valley in particular, and on the east side through the Brahmaputra, because most birds want to avoid the Himalayas and the Tibetan Plateau. So I mentioned stopover sites, and this is really key. This is the key thing for conservation, I think, that birds need these stopover flights on these routes. Most birds, or many birds, don't go direct. They'll go via stopover sites where they might spend a few days, might spend a few weeks, depending on the species. Lots of these are really small sites, but there are some really key ones. The Yellow Sea you may have heard of in China, and this will come in again when I talk about Bartia Godwit coming up. But it's a huge wetland that unfortunately much of it has been reclaimed, but is vitally important. There's 17 at least species of shorebirds that are globally threatened that rely on the Yellow Sea. Spoon-billed sandpiper, of course, most people are aware of that. The wetlands that they winter on or stage on are again vital. If those were to disappear, then the species will probably disappear. Now, we do have one very obvious stopover site, not the wetland one this time, but Amur falcons. We talked about the Doyoang Reservoir funnels such an enormous proportion of the population for a few weeks while they stop and they stage and they feed up before they move on. Hence, that's a vital place to be conserved. When do birds migrate? Okay, so well, there's sort of migration happening at any time of year, really. We know the peaks are March to May in North America and Europe, and in the autumn is August, November there. We're a little bit less obvious here, but what we'll come on to now is looking at certain species, individual species, and see if we can tell a little bit about when they migrate. Now for this coming up section, I've got lots of use of eBird, and in particular I want to credit Bird Count India, Ashwin and Taran, who've produced some of these animated maps that are fantastic for seeing how birds move through the year. So some of these I'll move through a little bit quickly because I've got lots of them and they're all fascinating. But one thing I think I'd like to get across on these is that you can all do this analysis. I'm just using standard eBird tools to have a look at their ranges and their timings, and it prompts questions more than answers in many places. But let's start. Let's look at bar-headed goose. So you can see from bar-headed goose that the entire population pretty much is wintering in India. And now they're in winter. As you see, as these dots move into Mongolia, into central China, and into Ladakh. There's three main clusters of breeding areas that you can see there. And I mentioned on their migrations, so one of the studies on bar-headed goose, which suggests that they don't go over the top of Mount Everest, is that they're known to hug the land. They follow the valleys as much as possible and take advantage of the wind through the valleys. And they rise and fall in flight a lot with the wind. So they have been tracked, it said up 7,290, but most of the time they're not going above 6,000 meters. But it's still pretty impressive, 6,000 meters. So there's a little frequency map there, which shows, for those of you who don't know, this is a simplified version, but this shows, based on eBird data, it's the proportion of complete checklists that reports this bird. So what that means is if I complete a checklist in eBird and I mark it complete, I've recorded every species I could, I've not missed off my common minors or anything else, then we can use that because we know from the 50 species on my checklist that I definitely haven't seen anything else. So you know what was there and what wasn't there, or at least wasn't recorded on my checklist. And these can be really useful for determining how the proportion of checklists for recorded species can tell you roughly how abundant or how present it is or how easy to detect it is. So you can see from that little chart, they're higher in January, February, March, but they're dropping down. There's a small peak again in the summer, and they drop down, and then there's another peak in December. If I go on a little bit more detail, one thing you don't get from that first map, of course, is that it's different in different parts of the country. So what I've done is just from the simple eBird bar chart, I think we could do, let's look at bar-headed geese in Karnataka and Kerala, and you can see how it's clearly a winter visitor. Birds leave in sort of April. By end of March, they've gone from Karnataka and Kerala. But if you go further north in the country, look at Delhi and Haryana, it's a little bit later. They still winter there. It's very high in the winter, so it's part of their wintering areas, but they're a little bit later leaving, as you'd expect. Now, one thing that's quite interesting in this place, there was a peak in the summer in that previous map, and of course we'd get them breeding in Ladakh. So if you look at Ladakh, and you add that on, I haven't used the same scales, so it's just look at the shape rather than the actual points on this. But those are the birds in Ladakh. So you can see in winter there are none, but then when they start to increase in Ladakh is exactly when they're leaving in the rest of India, or in Delhi and Haryana. And again, post-breeding, they leave quite suddenly, or at least according to what eBird data we have, in October, early October, mid-October, and then they're back on the wintering grounds quite soon. So one thing you can do with this is you could look at any species of these bar charts for your own area, see if you can see the patterns. Because one of the things in India, of course, we've got such a large country that not all our birds are winter visitors. We've got winter visitors in South India that breed in North India. Bar-headed goose is one of those, actually. So it's really interesting to look at a more local scale as well. Now, one thing I did on this is I wondered with a bird such as a bar-headed goose, it's got to fly up to lakes that are frozen, maybe, so it doesn't want to fly up into Ladakh and find all the lakes frozen, is I wondered whether they move from South India to North India and maybe stage a while, maybe wait a while. So a site such as Pong Reservoir in Himachal, which has huge numbers of wintering bar-headed geese, maybe the peninsular birds join them for a while in April, say, before they all leave to March to Ladakh. So I looked at this map of that, and one thing I saw that doesn't seem to be the case. They do appear to go straight to Ladakh, at least from what this graph says. Okay, another wildfowl, gargany this time. So gargany occurs across Europe. It's strongly migratory everywhere. It's the most familiar wintering duck for most of us in India. But it's an interesting one because it's known to have a differential migration. And males go for a molt migration, but typically 1 month before females. Males leave their wintering areas before females, and they arrive on the breeding grounds earlier. But then there are also a study I've seen that talks about garganies often pairing up in winter. So males and females are paired in winter, and then they're going to migrate together. So that seems a bit contradictory. Males are arriving first, but some pairs are pairing up. It would be interesting in India. I don't know what happens in India. We could probably tell in the spring if you're watching whether your gargany flocks have mostly males or females. Do they migrate at the same time? Do they not? Don't know. There's one thing from the map here. You can see that these European birds typically are going to go to Africa. The birds we get across all of India are probably the ones from Central Asia, rather than the European birds in this case. And I know there's a few ringing recoveries or birds that have been ringed in India that have been shot in Siberia, for example, that show that. Now, if you look at the maps for gargany, one thing you do see, Karnataka, so it's a common wintering duck where I'm in Karnataka, but I'm remembering in Delhi, it was more of a passage bird. You didn't see so many in the midwinter. And you can see that from these maps. Karnataka and Kerala is highest at the start of the year. Then there's another peak. So there's a peak in sort of mid-March in their graph before they all disappear by early May. Now that peak in mid-March is probably birds that are coming from even further south, say Sri Lanka, where it's a common winterer, they're now passing through Karnataka as well, so you get that extra peak. If you look in Delhi, you've got the same peak for what will be passage migrants in March, but you had a lot less birds in the winter. it wasn't wintering in such large numbers. Or at least when I say numbers, I'm not really talking numbers, because the data is frequency of occurrence. It's not so regularly reported. So it's not exactly telling you whether it's there in large numbers or not, but it's an indication. And then again in the autumn, we don't see any passage birds in the south. It's just wintering numbers building up. But in Delhi and Haryana, part of the north, they're seeing passage birds through until November, and then it drops down. Right, I'll show you this one just because this is a fantastic animation. This is again Madhu, it's done this brilliant animation. We all know that pied cuckoo heralds in the monsoon in India. Does it? So what you're looking at here is the rainfall, which is the greeny blue spread of rainfall through the monsoon, and the red is pied cuckoos. So the circles are actual records, and then the red is sort of showing the actual general range. And it's really quite interesting because it does show a very strong correlation between how pied cuckoos move through the country and how the rains move through the country. Whether that's pied cuckoo heralding the monsoon or not is a bit, maybe you're going a bit far, but there is clearly a strong relation. Common cuckoo is another fantastic one. I hope lots of you have seen some of the posts regarding the tracking studies for common cuckoos. It's widespread across Europe, as you can see in the summer. Europe on the map fills up completely, and those birds migrate to Africa. And there've been a few studies on where they go in Africa, and again they go to quite a small, consistent area. But then there's birds through Central and Eastern Asia. And these birds, particularly in sort of Mongolia, North and East China, no one knew where they wintered. People thought they might winter in Southeast Asia. People thought they might winter in India. Could they winter in Africa? And if you just look at the map, see now the birds in India, they've almost all gone now in January, February. Now they're coming through. They're in the Himalayas breeding. They're in China. Now they coming back through India. There's quite a lot in India, in the Western Ghats, but now they're thinned out again. So even just from this map, you can suggest whether they're coming to India, but they do thin out in the winter a little bit there. So the Beijing Cuckoo Project and the Mongolia Cuckoo Project, I hope you've seen some information about, have tagged several birds. And they've seen this fascinating migration where these birds, on a really quite rapid flight, do indeed go to southern Africa for the winter. And they pass through India. And so they've been tracked very precisely, passing through India in both autumn and spring, and it really is quite fascinating. So do look out for those posts if you haven't seen them. Now, in terms of timings, what do we see? Well, again, this is different in whichever part of the country you're in. Look at the Karnataka Kerala map at the top. It's a really strong passage migrant. There are lots of them around in October, November, or they're being seen fairly obviously, I should say, in October, November, and then they're gone. And there's a few through the winter, but nothing significant. But if you go further north, Delhi and Haryana, it's a summer visitor. But even just from this stage, it's not necessarily the commonest bird, but there is actually an April passage peak. Then there's a midsummer, July sort of peak for breeding birds. And then there's another passage period in end of September, early October. So it shows very clearly the different movements through the country. And common cuckoo is an important one because it suffered severe declines. So in Europe, in the UK, in fact, more than 50% of the population has gone in 20 years. Some of the tracking studies that they've done in Europe have shown that stopover sites are vital. Birds pause on migration and feed, and they also use very consistent routes. So the stopover sites are really key to conserve there. I forget what the figures are from some of the Asian birds, but I know one of the birds in the western migration, the bird that went from the Ivory Coast in West Africa to East England, did that journey of over 7,000 kilometers in 7 days. And I'm pretty sure the Mongolian birds have been tracked doing a similar speed and endurance migration through East Africa, Arabian Peninsula, or northwest India, and into China and Mongolia. Okay, demoiselle crane is a fascinating one. If you look at the map on this, the animated map, look how important Gujarat is for wintering population. They are breeding in Central Asia and Mongolia, and they're coming into India, and Gujarat is full, and not many other places see them typically. It's a real key wintering area. The other thing on their migration is that they do fly through the Himalayas. The fantastic photo you've got here of them migrating, and I would urge is you search out on YouTube a BBC Planet Earth video of demoiselle cranes being hunted by golden eagles on their migration. It's quite fascinating. The demoiselle crane is in Europe as well, and these western populations are very close to extinction. So these populations wintering in Gujarat, and also some going into Africa. You don't see so much on the eBird maps of Africa as there's less coverage, less data. But these populations are really important for us to be conserving. About this time last year, or early October last year, I'd been on a trek in Uttarakhand, not far from Gangotri. Not really birding, well, obviously I'm always birding, but it was with my daughter and a few other families. And it was very wet. I had been most of the time. It was pretty horrible. But we were standing outside the tents at about 6 o'clock, just as it was getting very dark one evening. And there was a gap in the rains, a little brief gap in clouds. And I heard a call, and I looked up, and through the small gap in the clouds, I saw 100 or 200 demoiselle cranes flying through, calling as they're setting off migration. And this is at 3,000 meter altitude. And it's one fantastic example. I'd love to see some daytime views like this of demoiselle cranes, which you can certainly do if you're in parts of the Himalayas toward the end of this month and through October. Bartow Godwit. I have to mention this one because it's one of the record holders. This map here shows Pacific Ocean. In the north, the red areas, its breeding range. If you look in particular at Alaska, so the east side of this map as we look at it, that green line shows the route of Bartow Godwits going to wintering areas in New Zealand. And that is a single flight across the ocean, non-stop, in 8 days, doing nearly 12,000 kilometers. An average speed of 60 kilometers per hour. And so that is the endurance record. It's the longest non-stop journey of any bird, any animal, in fact. In the spring, it does a slightly different route. So it goes to goes west, or northwest rather, and does this in 2 main stops. And that point at the elbow of that yellow line, that's the Yellow Sea in China. And so this is still a remarkable long flight to the Yellow Sea where they stop and stage. And so this shows you, in particular, shows you the importance of the Yellow Sea for one threatened shorebird here. But there are many others. Great Knot, for example, Northern Screenshanks is a vitally important site for those. Now, I'm showing you another map for this. You can just see for its distribution. Obviously, it's very coastal. So our records in India are all around the coast, West Coast in particular, but all around its range, it's very coastal. We see in Europe, West Africa, it's a really coastal bird. But you might notice there's like a red spot suddenly appears in the middle of India there. And this is quite interesting to look at in a little bit more detail. So there's your map of Bartow Godwit sightings in India. And you've got 2 obvious inland sightings, and that's it. There are only 2 inland records of Bartow Godwit. One's in Haryana and one's in Hyderabad. If you look at the chart in the bottom right, you can see that birds are present in the winter, the populations decline into the summer, and then there's pretty sudden peak of birds coming through on passage and staying through the winter. That sudden peak is pretty much mid-September. Sort of 2nd, 3rd weeks of September. And it's interesting when you look at the 2 records on the map of inland Bartow Godwits in India, they are exactly at that time. They are basically 2nd, 3rd week of September. So you can see if you're looking out for a rarity, you can look at some of this information and start to think, well, actually, what's today, 13th of September? I should be checking my inland wetlands. Maybe I could find a bar-tailed godwit. They're such a long-distance migrant that there's a chance of them going slightly off route, and that's what's happened here. But it's only 2 records in inland India. It's not very many at all. So interestingly, I was putting this one together a couple of days ago, and so yesterday when I was out birding, going out to a wetland just outside Bangalore, I thought, I'm going to find a bar-tailed godwit. Really a bit far-fetched, but I mentioned it, and then I thought, well, I suppose a Pacific golden plover would be quite nice. I haven't looked at Pacific golden plover. I would suggest you do Google that one. It's another fascinating long-distance migrant. It's obviously a lot commoner in India than bar-tailed godwit, and there's lots of inland records. But I've never seen one in this part of the country at all. And lo and behold, 1 minute after I mentioned it when I was out birding, we found a Pacific golden plover at a lake outside Bangalore. So the first one I've seen in my 15 years of birding here. Anyway, so keep an eye out for interesting passage waders at the moment. Oriental pratincoll, an interesting wader, not passage one this time. But it breeds, as you can see from this map, through East and Central and Southeast Asia mostly. Winters almost entirely in Northwest Australia. There is one site in Northwest Australia where they counted, they did an aerial survey and counted, it was about 2.8 million birds on this one site. But they didn't really know where it breeds. There's a ringing study, had only ever had 1 recovery from Taiwan. And then what happened was, last year, they satellite tagged 5 birds in Australia, and these went off sort of as expected to Cambodia and Taiwan and Thailand, but one of them moved west from Thailand and moved to India. And then it came down through Orissa and it ended up in Karnataka, and it stayed there. And from the stationary data they were getting, it seemed like it must have been breeding in Karnataka. And so the fascinating thing was that Subbu Subramania, I'm sure many of you know of, took a few people and headed to North Karnataka for a few days in June last year. They got some information in real time from where the tagged birds seemed to be. And I think after about 3 days there, they found it. And the photo is Subbu's photo. You can see there's a tag on the leg of the bird. And you may just be able to see a sort of long antenna that's just underneath the wings that extends beyond the tail. And so this is the tagged bird that was the first ever recovery, I think, of an Australian shorebird in India, and found to be breeding in India where no one thought it would be. So a really great story. Unfortunately, of course, no one could go back this year to see whether it was still there. Right, something quite different. Wilson storm petrel. I don't know if any of us have been lucky enough to see them on one of the pelagic trips off southwest India or off Chennai or something in this time of year, in fact, ideally. But Wilson storm petrel is the opposite to almost everything else we've discussed because it breeds in the southern hemisphere. And it's the southern hemisphere summer, of course, our winter. And then in its non-breeding season, which is our summer, it wanders around the oceans. And they wander a long way. Then wandering up to the North Atlantic. You can see loads of them off the east coast of the US. But equally, they're actually quite common in the Arabian Sea. I've quite a few years, I've spent some time in Goa in the monsoon time in August and September. And if you stare out to sea for long enough in Goa, you have a very good chance of seeing Wilson's storm petrel. And they're amazing birds. You get a chance to go on a boat trip as well. They're just fascinating. These tiny birds, size of a house sparrow, spends most of his life roaming around the oceans. Anyway, if you look at the map on these, again, you can see how it's actually a summer visitors here. Birds are wandering around in our summer. First birds in sort of May. Then, unfortunately, of course, we don't get out to sea during monsoon time. We can't go, so there's not so many. But then when we have done a few more trips in September, October, it's quite commonly encountered on pelagics. And I'm sure if you're in Kerala or you're in Goa or in Karnataka at the moment, Maharashtra, stare out to sea. You might need a scope. They might be quite a long way off, and they might be tiny little dots, but there's Wilson storm petrels out there. Might have a bit more chance of seeing one of these at the moment. European roller. They breed in Central Asia, and so they breed through Europe, but our birds are more interesting in Central Asia typically. There's a few breed in Kashmir, but how we know this bird in India really is, this is an absolute, it's the perfect classic autumn passage migrant. It's common in the northwest, Gujarat and Rajasthan, at this time of year. Much commoner than Indian roller. And if you're doing a journey along the roads or something, you'll see these perched up on the wires. You'll probably see a bird every one or two birds every kilometre on a drive. So it winters in sub-Saharan Africa, and it's known that they overlap, our Central Asian birds overlap with European birds a bit. But they do know from some of the studies, the tracking studies that have been done, that Western European birds tend to in Western Africa a bit more. Eastern European birds in Eastern Africa is a bit more. And also, they know that some of the most northerly breeders in Europe actually migrate the furthest. So they're the ones that go down to South Africa. And that's called leapfrog migration, where there's populations doing a longer distance migration, jumping over other populations. So it'd be interesting to know where our Kashmir breeders go. So, for example, maybe they don't go so far and they get leapfrogged by the Central Asian breeders. But the map of European roller is interesting. You see on the small map, that's it. It's only an autumn passage migrant. There's no other status in India. And if you look more regionally, you can see how the timings differ. It's exactly as you'd expect in northwest India. I think I looked at, this was looking at Gujarat and Rajasthan in the northwest India map. And it's interesting here, if you look at the scale on the map, on the chart this time, the frequency is at 24-25%. There's 1 in 4 eBird lists has European roller on it at this time of year. It's a really common bird in Gujarat, Rajasthan. And now, don't get misled, the scale of the South India one is not the same. I've just drawn it to show the timings. So it's a really scarce bird in southwest India, obviously. But the timings mirror the northwest Indias. They're just about a month behind, which is really exactly what you'd expect. And then they're all gone. So these birds don't stay here in the winter. They migrate through, and so they're migrating to Africa. I'm going to do a very quick Ammer falcon because I know you've had a 2-hour webinar on it. But if you just look at the map here, you can see it really illustrates their migration well, going from southeast Russia, North China, through India. Here they come now, through India. Look at that purple blob in the northeast where they're staging in Nagaland, and then most of them going to South Africa itself. So the journey they do across the sea is more than 3,000 kilometers across open sea. And that's the longest sea crossing that any raptor does. As we mentioned earlier, raptors generally don't cross over the sea. Now, falcons are active flyers. They're not soaring birds like your eagles and honey buzzards and things, but it's still quite a feat, 3,000 kilometers across. And I'm sure you're well aware of the conservation issues of those. So I'll do the shortest ever Ammer falcon one. There's another interesting bird. So these are the ones you don't think of as such obvious migrants. So these are because we're not talking long distance migrants, and we're talking birds that are winter visitors and summer visitors within India. So when you look at the map, you can see that at different times of year, it is pretty much all over India. But they're wintering very much in the south. And then by sort of March time, they're spread and they're across most of peninsular India. If you look at the timings, you can see that exactly. Very different charts regionally. So in Karnataka and Kerala, they are purely winter visitors. In Delhi and Haryana, it's summer visitor. And so this is where it's interesting to do this yourself, and some species you know. Have a look at the regional maps, not just the India-wide ones. These are black and brown shrikes. So one nice thing I think about these, that this map, showing both of them on the same map, is the purple being Isabellae and green being brown, is that their breeding areas are alongside each other. Isabellae are in sort of Mongolia, Central Asia, brown shrike are further east in China. And I'll wait for that to happen. There we are there. When they come down on passage, they're taking almost parallel routes. And in India, The Isabellines are really just in the northwest. The browns are everywhere else. And the Isabellines are going on to Arabia and Africa. So they've sort of got breeding, wintering, and passage routes that are all sort of parallel with each other. The picture there, although the bottom picture of the brown shrike is the Philippine shrike, Lucianensis subspecies that we get a little bit in South India. And what would be very interesting would be to know how their migration changes. That is obviously not nearly as common, and the ID is quite difficult because lots of birds are quite intermediate. But if we had a bit more data, we could probably see where are those coming from, how do their timings differ. Now, one thing here, you look at the patterns of these Isabelline brown shrike, they're very, very similar. Their timings are really pretty similar. I think the only difference I possibly see here is that brown shrikes, on the red graph at the bottom, seems to have, although it's common in winter, there is a little bit of a peak as a passage peak in March. And then in the autumn, certainly the highest frequency is when they first arrive in October, and then they drop down a little bit. Whereas Isabelline doesn't show that. Isabelline doesn't show any passage at all. It's just wintering birds, really. But when you think about it, that makes sense, because Isabellines are wintering in the northwest. There aren't any areas in India they pass through on the way to their wintering grounds, really. A little bit in Uttarakhand and places, but not much. Whereas brown shrikes are wintering majorly in South India, so those birds are passing through the rest of India on their way out. Trickier one, ashy drongo. And these ones I think are very interesting. You could look at black drongo, would be another interesting one. Green beaters, little swifts, all these birds we don't tend to think of as migrants, but are at least in part of their range. So ashy drongo is widespread in the winter, breeds in the Himalayas, but it also has this central Indian breeding population, quite a small, isolated one. Watch the spots on the map just coming in now, that little patch in central India. So this would be interesting here to know where the different populations are going. So these Western Himalayan breeders, for example, do they migrate all the way down to South India? Are the Central Indian ones actually resident? They don't migrate at all. Do the Himalayan ones leapfrog the Central Indian ones? Quite difficult to work this sort of thing out, obviously. But if we look at the charts on these, there you can see South India and Central India. So South India, it's purely a winter visitor. In Central India, there's a few in the winter, but it's got a clear peak in May and June for breeding birds. But when you've got multiple populations here, knowing where they each go is quite tricky to know without any actual tagging studies. There's one point that's worth mentioning you'll see on lots of these species charts is in July and August then, do ashy drongos disappear? There's none here. There's none in South India and there's none in Central India, pretty much. And you'll find other species that do the same sort of thing, seem to have these gaps here. Where do they go then? Oriental honey buzzard, you'll find is one, I think, disappears. Indian pitta wars, actually, we didn't really look at it, but that does a similar thing. And of course, it's not actually that they're disappearing, but this is just that prior to breeding, birds are obvious. They're calling, they're setting up their territories, we find them quite easily. When they're actually in the midst of breeding, they're not singing, they're not calling, they're feeding young, they're quiet, they're unobtrusive because they don't want to attract predators. So they're difficult to find. So if we see those drops when they might be post-breeding, it's probably just that the birds are more difficult to find than they've actually gone anyway. Yellow-browed warbler, quite a rare one, obviously, but this is a fascinating one globally. If you look at the bottom right map, that's BirdLife International's map of yellow-browed warblers. Very wide breeding range across all of Russia in particular and eastern China. Passage through to wintering in Southeast Asia and a little bit in eastern India. But if you look at the animated map, you see that pattern, but look at all those European records. Where have they come from? Year-round as well. Those are winter records now we're looking at. And then, okay, they're not there in the breeding season, they've gone then. But from September onwards, they're piling into Europe and Western Europe again. And what's fascinating about this is new. Yellow-browed warblers in Western Europe used to be quite a scarce migrant. There'd be some seen every autumn. They'd be going astray from such a wide breeding range. It's not surprising that they turn up with some regularity in storms and like long periods of easterly winds in the autumn, that sort of thing. So they were a scarce, rare autumn passage migrant. But they've stayed. They've now gradually moved down. So you see lots in Spain and Portugal, where they were really rare. But there's a major population there. Now they're almost taking two separate wintering routes. Birds are going south to the Southeast Asia population that we knew about, but a lot of these birds are now going west and a bit southwest to winter in Europe. And this is really last 20, 30 years that this has happened. Green and greenish, should be looking out for these any day now. Very similar species, obviously quite difficult to ID in most of the cases. Green, which handily is in green in this map, is quite a small breeding area, eastern Turkey through the Caucasus, and is southwest India wintering. That's the whole population. Greenish is quite common in Western Europe, you see. The migration here is a southeasterly migration, really, for both populations. And our greenish is wintering throughout India. We actually have two subspecies, which makes this more interesting, because it does breed in the Himalayas, the European one. And you can tell the difference if you're up with the calls. There is a difference, and a slight plumage difference, but they're a bit tricky. But the southeasterly migration is quite interesting for green warbler. Why do those birds not go to Africa through the Middle East, like lots of other birds do? One of the things quite interesting I found in this one is the little chart we have of the frequencies suggests that greenish leave a little bit later and arrive in India a little bit earlier than green warbler. And it's quite difficult to use eBird data for this because a lot of the IDs are not necessarily certain because they're tricky species. So I looked at this in a little bit more detail. But what I did this time was took the greenish only from South India, ignoring all these northeasterly ones, for example. And when you look at the pattern then of just South India, you see actually there's no difference in timings here. These are almost identical charts. So green and greenish, according to this, are from the South India birds, leave at just the same time. So going backward, not like that graph, which is looking at entire Indian population. And of course, the entire Indian population includes birds wintering in the northeast. It includes these Himalayan breeders, so they've not got so far to go, probably. But it just shows it's worth looking at regional information, not just India-wide for some species. Bly's Reed, one we're very familiar with, of course. Another super animation from Madhu. So again, the dots of Bly's Reed, as you can see how they follow the as the weather changes, the daylight changes, and they spread right across into Europe. A few in Britain, but Scandinavia they breed. Now everyone is in India in the winter. The whole of the population is pretty much going to India. But the interesting thing here would be they've got such a wide range from Western Europe through to Central Asia. Is do those different populations have different areas that they winter in India? I think there's been some studies on birds ringed in Sweden, for example, which have been recovered in in a small area. I'm not sure where in India, but quite a small area those birds found wintering. So there probably are populations that have their favoured wintering areas, and especially from a species that sometimes comes back to the same garden. You're quite familiar probably with your Bly's Reed warblers that show strong site fidelity. Look at the timings of these; they're very predictable. So we did this little experiment in the spring, actually. Quite a few of us in Bangalore watching through lockdown, so you're only really watching in your own gardens, looked at when they left, when these Bly's Reed warblers left. And then in the north, in Delhi, Gurgaon, this is just looking at Delhi and Gurgaon only. Again, people looking at their gardens, they come through as a fairly obvious passage migrant. And so you can see its population has dropped considerably from our Bangalore area. Around 15th to the 20th of April is the time when the birds are sort of coming into the peak in Delhi. and they're peaking there in early May, but then they're gone within 2 weeks, more or less. And similarly in the autumn, you see an earlier peak in Delhi where they don't winter. They're quite a scarce winter bird in that area. A few stay on, but not many do. So they come down south with a very, very common winterer. There's the white-throat, another one we're very used to. All these birds, actually what's quite interesting on these is looking at Europe first of all the European birds, even when the ones that breed in Britain, for example, they all migrate southeast. So all of them come through the Middle East. None of them go through Spain, Portugal, over Gibraltar, which is a major migration route. They all travel on this southeasterly direction. And now, of course, the taxonomy's changed. So eBird lumps lesser white-throat and Hume's white-throat, which we've shown separately here. But it is actually interesting to try and identify the two different populations, because we do know now that in South India, they're mostly Humes. There aren't very many lesser white-throats. So that's the Humes being the one that breeds in Ladakh and further into Central Asia. So they come right down South India. Lesser white-throat is pretty rare, actually, in extreme southern India. And that wasn't really very well known years ago, partly because they were considered one species then. People probably started paying more attention when they were split, and now they've gone back to being lumped as one species again, so, but hopefully you'll still try to pay attention to them. Rosy starling. Most interesting thing about rosy starling, again, almost all the population from Europe, Eastern Europe it breeds, and Central Asia, all of them are wintering in the subcontinent. But the other interesting thing here, I think, is that this is a really slow migrant. In fact, you can see this well on this frequency chart here. They arrive very early, June even, birds are arriving, June, July in Rajasthan, Gujarat. But they're very slow, slowly increasing to their peak. And they're very slow moving through the country. This was something that was done using Migrant Watch before we adopted eBird in India, and there was the Migrant Watch project which ran for a few years, looking at the arrival dates of rosy starlings. And you can see that they're arriving mid-July in Rajasthan, Gujarat, but we're not really seeing them until November even in southern India. So there's a really gradual, slow migration through the country. Whereas spot-winged starling is a unique one and does a very strange migration. So spot-winged starlings breed in west and central Himalayas. You can see the spots are just coming in, a fairly small area, but they migrate east. And their wintering areas are in parts of northeast India and southeast Asia. But it's a really unusual migration direction for a western Himalayan breeder that heads east. More familiar to most of us, red-breasted and tiger flycatchers. Again, a difficult ID problem, but we have enough data of confirmed records to be able to see. You look at the breeding ranges now, they're quite separate. Western Europe, or Europe generally, West Central Asia, the red-breasted flycatcher, and tiger is east. It's in the tiger zone, but China, Russia, Mongolia. But both populations are majorly in India in winter. You see some of the red-breasteds are in sort of Arabia, and a lot of tigers are in Southeast Asia, but the two populations meet in India. Even in India, the red-breasted are pretty westerly. You can see most of it. Tiger, I was a bit surprised with this. Tigers seem to be everywhere, but they clearly have much more of an easterly bias. And again, so there's a nice example of those two converging in India. Black red start is a little bit different, and it's a short distance migrant. They don't go very far. Again, you get the European birds you see in Spain and Portugal are full all year round. So they breed there, they also winter there. Northern Europe, they migrate a little bit, but not very far. In India, of course, they winter throughout most of the country, not too many in the south, but they also breed in the Western Himalayas. You see the spot there now in the Western Himalayas. There's a lot that breed in the Western Himalayas. And in Europe, they're another leapfrog migrant. So these Northern European ones might go down to North Africa, for example, jumping over the French and Spanish. Do they do the same in India? Are the wintering birds we get through central India, for example, are they the Central Asian China breeders? Do the Western Himalayan birds maybe not move very far? Maybe they're even resident there. So an interesting one to have a look at. So actually, with this, I would, rather than use that little chart there, look into a little bit more detail on these. And you see that there are very few wintering in the red Himalayas. There are some migrant there very clearly. But peninsular India, they are clearly a winter migrant only. And actually, you see quite nicely as it drops off in mid-April for all the winterers is when it starts to pick up, or it picks up a little bit later. It picks up a little bit later in June. So there's a bit of a gap there. When I said Himalayas here, I changed this a bit. I looked at higher Himalayas. So this is actually looking at Kashmir, Ladakh, and Himachal, because I took out Uttarakhand just out of interest, because, I haven't got it on in this map. In Uttarakhand, I think it's mostly a passage migrant. I forgot to put it onto this map. But it just shows, again, if you look regionally, it's a bit more interesting for some of these species. Common rosefinch is a similar one a little bit. Now, again, almost the entire population winters in the subcontinent. There's been some birds that have been tagged in Sweden and been detected wintering in central India. And they were a clear loop migrant in this case. In the spring, they went on a quite direct route, but in the autumn, they took a more northerly route, coming sort of east and then south a bit more. And it's thought that's probably to avoid the Central Asian deserts in the autumn when there's not so much food there. But in the spring, when they're moving through faster anyway, and there's some more food in the deserts, they can take a more direct route. Okay, this is another one where I look at, again, they breed here, but you see a very clear inverse of wintering birds in peninsular India and summering birds in the Himalayas. This is one where I was looking at. I then decided to look at Uttarakhand only. And when you look at Uttarakhand only, it doesn't breed, but you've got a very strong passage period. So you've got these birds leaving peninsular India, presumably, passing through Uttarakhand in a strong peak in quite a short period of time, but not breeding there, or rarely breeding there, but breeding higher up. And so obviously this is India, this is Himachal and Kashmir and Ladakh. Right, I could go on for many, many, many species, but I will leave you to investigate some others. But I couldn't miss this one out because this is my favorite, I think. Northern wheatear, for many reasons, is a fascinating bird. If you live in the UK, it's often the very first migrant you find in the spring. They start to appear typically in early March. So you're on the lookout for northern wheatears. And where I lived in the UK was on the south coast, so you'd be looking out on beaches for birds suddenly to appear on the beach that have just come across the English Channel. So it's always a highlight of the first sign of spring, really. It's also interesting because we have a few records in India, and I fortunately, when I was birding with Chris Bowden last year, we managed to find one in Karnataka, which is an enormous surprise, and that was in March. So I looked into this a little bit more detail, thinking, well, what's it going to be doing in March in southern India? But northern wheatear is just an amazing migrant. So this map doesn't necessarily show that clearly, but in the top left of this map, you're looking at eastern Canada, where it breeds, but it breeds all the way across this map through to the far right-hand side, which is actually Alaska. So it's got an enormous breeding range. In fact, it's breeding, it goes a bit beyond Alaska there, so it goes into Canada. So it's actually breeding in Canada, in the east and the west of Canada, and only missing out a little bit in the middle. So it's all the way across Northern Europe and Asia. But the entire population winters in Africa. I mean, it's south of the Sahara and this yellow, orange, red band there. And that just seems remarkable. When you think about this, if you take the birds on the east, these Alaskan breeders, you look at the range, this is some tagged birds that have come across Siberia, through Central Asia, down through Arabia into East Africa. That's just an enormous migration. It's the longest migration of any songbird, 14,500 kilometers. And so I talked about the bird that we saw in Karnataka in March. There's 2 records in Kerala in October. So you think, well, okay, these are birds that are doing this enormous long migration that have gone slightly wrong and appeared in Kerala in October. And then in the spring, they migrate back. They take a route through, mainly through Ladakh. And this is in recent years. We've got more and more records in Ladakh and in the Pakistan side as well, on the mountains there. And it was recently discovered breeding. So the first breeding record for the Indian subcontinent. So you have a chance of seeing this in April, May, passing back through on this route. But that got me wondering about the bird that was in March in Karnataka. What's it doing in March in Karnataka? They take a different route back in the spring. They're going, so would it really have flown from the orange polygon in East Africa there all the way across the Arabian Sea to end up in Karnataka? Seems a bit strange when it normally would go north to start with across the land. So I tend to think actually the bird in Karnataka in March, probably like the Kerala birds, might have turned up in October, but then not decided to cross the Arabian Sea and remained wintering in Karnataka, unbeknown to us until we saw it in March. So it's a pretty amazing bird, but that's not all of it, because if you look at the left-hand side of this map, these birds that are in eastern Canada and Greenland, they also are going to south of the Sahara. And so it's not quite as long a flight as the Alaskan birds, but it's a long sea crossing that they have. So these birds actually have the longest transoceanic flight of any passerine. And because it's transoceanic, it also happens to be the longest non-stop flight, clearly. So they're record breakers on both sides of their range. So it really is like a remarkable bird. Anyway, as you can see, I could go on. You can pick a species and go through it. I won't go through it anymore, but I'd suggest have a look yourself. There are lots of interesting birds to look at, particularly Indian birds that are restricted to India. So something like an Indian golden oriole that's a summer visitor to the north, but a winter visitor in the south. Altitudinal migrants, more verditer flycatchers, grey-headed canary flycatchers. What about blue throat, the great one? Forest wagtail, interesting Indian one. There are lots. So what I would like to say, I suppose, is have a look yourself. Make sure you're recording them well, but use eBird data and see if you can work out patterns in your local areas as well. Okay, thank you very much.
Thank you, Mike. Can everyone put your hands together for Mike, please? That was a wonderful presentation. Thank you so much.
You're very welcome. It's a big topic, and as you see, I could have got on and on. Choosing a few species to do every species is fascinating.
It is, and it is a topic that needs a lot more reading and research.
Absolutely. As I say, I mean, there's experts in this field don't know lots of things, and I'm certainly no expert. But I, just through my regular birding, I've always been fascinated by migration. I think I've probably, hopefully, shown how you could all find something out and contribute there.
It's so different from the human migration. But let's get back to the topic in hand. Shrikant, the questions are listed out, I think.
Yeah, there are quite a few questions, but thanks, Mike. That was quite interesting topic which you picked today for us. Thank you so much. I think a lot of delight for us. So just starting off with the questions. The first question is by Anjali. She asks, are reasons for altitudinal migration and seasonal migration similar?
Yes, they are really. I mean, all these types of migration are really because of food and nesting areas, food in particular. So with altitudinal migrants, I didn't talk about so much, and that's partly because it's more difficult with the short distance and with the data we have to analyze them so well. But yeah, they're migrating for food. So altitudinal migration is majorly affected by bad weather. So snowfalls higher up force birds down. Insect eaters clearly can't get insects high up in the winter. They're just not around. And that's also what leads to some of the exciting things. So in the lots of Himalayan breeders that come down, so you can see them in the northern plains in the winter. And I mentioned things like the wall creeper and things like that, but there's also some. You don't necessarily have to go if you're birding, say, still in the lower Himalayas, like at 2,000 meters and things. Then maybe you've got a chance of seeing birds that don't normally come down at all, but get forced down not to the plains, but to those 2,000 meters bit. So you might think so something like spectacled finch, which I've never seen and have tried to a couple of times. It's quite an unpredictable bird. It's driven by bad weather somewhere that restricts its food supply, and therefore it moves lower down and it appears in various places, but not where I've ever been. So yeah, the reasons are basically the same: food, and survival.
And survival, yes. Thank you, Anjali. I hope that was answered. And the next question is by Debashish Karmakar, and his question is, what is celestial navigation?
Celestial navigation?
Yeah.
That's navigation via the stars. So I mentioned a little bit about.
I think that was answered in your talk also, Mike. Yeah.
Birds clearly do use the stars. I think what's interesting about they use the sun, they use the stars, they use the magnetic fields is different species presumably rely on the different ways a bit more than others. Do they all use all of them? Which ones are most used? Which ones aren't? Don't think many people. Don't think we know.
That is correct. So the next question is by JVD Murthy, and the question is, it's a four-part question.
Okay.
So this goes like, there was an article I read some time ago that a protein in the eyes of the bird lets them see Earth's magnetic fields. Question number one, what's the trick here? The color spectrum. Question number two, can the birds read the polarity as well, or do they use the sun and the stars to know which way is north or south? I will go to the next question, but I think we can cover the first two bits.
I'll take that. Yeah, it's a very good question. I don't know. It's not an area I've ever really looked at. I know that it's known as magnetite. That's been detected in birds' eyes, and so it's thought that might be used in detecting the magnetic field. They don't have a specific organ for detecting it, if you like, but it's thought that might be something to do with it.
Do humans have it as well?
Pardon?
Do humans have the magnetite as well? No.
We don't, apparently. So birds do and we don't. So there might well be something in that.
Okay.
Polarity, yes. Again, this is partly the thinking as if they can detect magnetic fields, can they detect? They can detect
north and the south. Mm-hmm.
They can detect the angle of inclination. Can they use all this to be able to pinpoint a place on a map effectively? That's what I was talking about. Can they derive their latitude, longitude effectively by detecting all this? I don't know. It's not an area I've ever really looked at, but it's a fascinating one.
Yeah. Do you think it has anything to do with, say, we sometimes say, okay, there is one stray bird, for example. Does it mean that it has lost its navigational capability?
Well, there's another webinar on itself just to talk about stray birds.
I think I look forward to that.
Yeah, that will be a tricky one. I mean, yeah, that's fascinating. I'd say why birds turn up, stray birds. Yeah, one of the things, I mean, in stray birds, most of the real vagrant birds tend to be young birds. So in the autumn, they're the first winter birds. So they're inexperienced. They haven't done the routes before. They can more easily get sent off their direct route, for example. So maybe that is something to do with that. They don't have such a well-developed sense of well, it could be any of these. It could be the magnetic field. It could be the knowledge of the stars is not quite so good. But certainly young birds are more susceptible to vagrancy than older birds typically. So that would be one reason. I mean, there are various reasons. So obviously, weather comes into it, and there's also unexplained reasons. And it's different in the spring compared to the autumn typically as well. Good question. But yeah, undoubtedly it's young birds that get impacted more. So presumably it is that they're not as good at navigating.
Okay. So the third question is, do resident birds lack this protein that sees the magnetic field? What about partial migrants?
Very good question. And I haven't a clue. I don't know.
But is there any work going on this, Mike?
I don't know. I would assume so. I mean, there's there's hundreds of papers that come out every year on migration. So this isn't an area I know at all. But
I'd be happy if you could send me some links which I could then look up and then read them
Yeah.
up myself.
I haven't seen much on that, but there's certainly stuff out there. So yeah, I'll have a quick look at it.
Thank you.
And the final question of his four-part question is how do long-distance migrants cope after they cross the equator as the magnetic field changes with the change in location? That is correct.
I can just answer I don't know to all your questions.
So,
Because they can presumably detect the direction of the magnetic field. So, but I don't know. I mean, whether they presumably do detect the crossing the equator from the direction of the magnetic field.
But it's a very strong theory that they do use the feet.
Yes, so it has been proved with caged experiments and birds being subject to coils. I think European robins had a big experiment on using coils to create magnetic fields. So yeah, it's known for sure. And it does make some sense that if they are using that, it's probably what they rely on most because, as I mentioned, the stars and the sun are subject to weather conditions, that they might not be able to use those. So it makes sense that there is something else that they can use regardless of the weather, almost.
Thank you, Mike. I've got lots more, but then let's go on to the others.
yes. So the next question is by Pratik Panwar, and his questions again: is it true about wagtails that the young one lead the migration? And the second question is: which month shell ducks molt and the locations?
The young ones lead the migration. I don't think I wouldn't say lead as in terms of like leading in a group necessarily, but timings may well differ and locations may well differ. I mentioned differential migration. I don't know with wagtails in particular. I don't think I've seen it. If you look at flocks of yellow wagtails, which presumably should be arriving in most parts of India now, it will be interesting to try and see whether they seem to mostly be young ones or not. So I don't know. There are timing differences, most certainly. And so it's funny actually, it's every year in say July, mid-July, or even earlier sometimes when someone sees a common sandpiper or a green sandpiper, they'll always comment and say, wow, this bird must have stayed here or it's incredibly early or something like that. And it's not, it's normal. It's every year. Every year you're finding those waders turning up at that time of year, even end of June sometimes. And what's known there is that those first birds are usually adults that have presumably failed to breed. So they've given up on the breeding grounds. They've left earlier. They're not going to breed this year. But then when you'll get birds where the adults, especially the males, might leave first because they finished their parenting duties. So they'll leave on migration. The young follow a little bit later. So that can explain part of the difference. Cuckoo, of course, the earliest cuckoos play no part in bringing up their young. So the adult cuckoos leave incredibly early. And then the juveniles will be a couple of months later. So I don't know whether there's many cases where juveniles come before adults, obviously. But yeah, I mean, it's something we could probably tell in some species.
Oh, okay. That's interesting. Okay. Yeah, go on, Srikant.
So, so just moving on. Which month the shell ducks molt and the locations?
In India, I don't know. I think in sort of Europe, the common shell duck, which is a common bird in most of Europe, is sort of July, August, September, that sort of time frame. Ruddy shell duck is probably similar, post-breeding. Bar-headed goose might be the similar one as well, post-breeding. I don't know whether they have molt migrations. I expect they do, so they might congregate. I've not spent any time in Ladakh at that time of year, but they might well congregate together in certain lakes areas. So it'll be that sort of. It's basically it's when they finished breeding anyway, and prior to migration.
Okay. I see. Okay.
Thanks. I think Pratik, your questions have been answered. And the next question is actually by me. So, why do same birds migrate to different parts of the country? For example, grey wagtail is a part Himalayan breeder, but It's a widespread winter migrant, and it is seen as south as Kanyakumari. Any reason some birds choose to migrate that far south when they can just stay in central India?
Oh,
Yeah, I don't know. I would assume that it becomes partly down to a competition thing. They're a very common bird. There are a lot of them. So in their cases, they're not necessarily such specialist feeders that they can only stay in one sort of area. They can be anywhere. There might well be a population, that might be an example of leapfrog migration, where, for example, the northernmost breeders are traveling further, possibly. But maybe our Himalayan breeders there are the ones that are staying in sort of North India, Central India through the winter, and ones from Central Asia that are flying further to South India.
So it depends mostly on from where they're actually migrating from.
Yeah, and what they need, what their fooding needs in the winter. I mean, obviously, ducks and things need particular wetlands, so you'll find them congregating in the same places. Something like a grey wagtail, don't know, it's not so specialist, can probably be more or less anywhere in South India, Central India, and find food.
Okay. Just as an extension to this question, even Kentish plovers, they're not breeders of, I would say, especially in and around Hyderabad. They're not known records of them breeding around here. But in the past 5 years, we have been recording Kentish plover breeding over here. So what could be the change in that behavior that it led to the breeding?
Well,
there is a good breeding population now of at least, I would say, this year it was about 10 breeding pairs I've seen. Only in one location. I'm not talking about the others, but just one location there were about 10 breeding pairs. So what could be the...
I would assume it's something fairly local because they are known. I mean, there are resident, or at least there are Indian breeders of Kentish plovers, and always have been different subspecies. So I would imagine it's just a local thing that for some reason you've not been noting them around in Hyderabad, but you have been recently.
Yes.
It's been moved on locally, but they will be part of the Indian breeding population anyway. I didn't think about that one, but we're going to look at little ring plover. Is another good example.
Yes.
Common winter bird, but also fairly common breeder through lots of the country, and that would be an interesting one to look at range and patterns of.
Okay. Well, yeah, thank you. And another question by Pratik, actually, any info on large concentrations of Egyptian vultures crossing Shivaliks over Rajaji National Park?
I know there's large concentrations in winter for feeding, and there are in Rajaji. There are obviously Rajasthan in Jorbia is the other one, famous one. But again, Egyptian vulture is an interesting one because again, there's two populations there. Supposedly, an Indian resident one and the wintering one. That I think aren't very different. I think one has a dark black bill tip and one has a yellowish bill tip. But I'm not entirely sure whether that's reliable or not. So I'd say it's presumably that the feeding is very good, therefore it's a very popular. Where they're coming from, though, I don't know whether those are Indian birds or whether they're coming from a population in Central Asia, for example.
Okay.
That would be interesting. And there is something. Egyptian vultures do supposedly have these two different subspecies that may be identifiable. So that would be something worth looking at. Are they all majorly one subspecies, which is the Indian resident one, or are they the migrant one?
Okay. Thank you. So the next question is by Debashish Karmakar, and he asks, is there any relationship of the migration with the shape and structure of the wing and the whole body?
A little bit, yes, there is. So you find, for example, that in lots of passerines, so lots of warblers like this, longer distance migrants have a longer wing. So they have a longer, more pointy wing than shorter distance migrants. You'll find this certain warblers you can look at if you refer to the primary projection sometimes. So the length of how long the primaries extend beyond the tertials, and the longer winged birds are more longer, slimmer wings are more adapted to longer flights. There's certain physiological changes that birds undergo in migration as well. And I know from the Bata Godwit example, which is doing this 12,000 kilometers one way, one non-stop flight. So they obviously feed up well before the journey, but I think some of their organs shrink to almost nothing So their intestines, for example, they don't have a use for their intestines, and they shrink to almost nothing. The gonads, I think, do the same thing. So there's a few changes they go, physical changes they undergo to be adapted for the migration. Obviously, molt, we talked about, to have a fresh set of feathers prior to migration for most species.
Okay, thank you. So the next question is by, I'm sorry, just a second. Yeah, Sridhar, and the question is, what is the effect of climate change on migration?
Okay, this is another good one, and there's probably a webinar on this if you know it well. Yeah, I know. I mean, certainly long-term studies have shown that climate change is having an effect. So things like in North America and through Western Europe, many migrants are arriving on their breeding grounds earlier. But that maybe is not so much of a problem necessarily, but the other thing is a lot of migrants are having to migrate further. So they're having to go further north now, and probably consequently going further south in the winter. So they're doing longer migrations. And I remember reading, I don't know the full details of the study, but there was a modeling done on a European beta, I think, which came up with something like they estimated that their migratory journey would be 1,000 kilometers longer in 50 years' time than it is today. So that's pretty drastic. That's like another 4 or 5 days flying time that they estimated.
They would be exhausted, absolutely exhausted.
That's exactly it. If they've got longer flying times, they need more fuel. They need better staging sites. So this is an extreme risk. We're losing staging sites. So the conservation areas for staging sites, and for something like, obviously the staging sites for the waders, we can talk about yellow sea and how important that is. But staging sites and things like for bee eaters, well, they're feeding at various places. There aren't such key identifiable sites that we need to make sure we must protect this one area. It's probably just lots of general habitat that is needed. Yeah, that the conservation impact there is very significant.
Yeah, it could also have an impact on the breeding.
Yep.
Yeah.
Yep. They've gone to go further.
Sorry, Shrikant.
Yeah. So the next question is by Chinmay, our young bird over here, and he asks, how do they fly with their weight that they gained a few days or weeks ago, and can we identify by their formation of flight?
Okay, so firstly, yes, I mean they're gaining weights, they're gaining fat. So it's fat that they gain and fat that they burn for energy. So obviously they're losing that weight every day or throughout their migration. But yes, they will double their body weight sometimes prior to migration. So it's a pretty significant change. Equally, we mentioned that, I mean, they're putting out extra fat. So some of their organs are shrinking because they don't need them, but they're putting on that amount of fat as fuel for the journey. So they filled up the car with lots of snacks until it's bursting and they have to squeeze into their seats. But then they're just about geared up for their journey. So it's pretty remarkable. They're putting on a lot of extra weight, but they're also burning it quite quickly. So I guess in that first day, after a first day, they've lost 10% of that weight already after one day. So if they manage the first day, then they can manage the weight on the subsequent days, but they're losing fuel, losing energy. Formation of flight is a good question. Yes, to some extent we can. So, you know, the birds that are flying in Vs, so cranes, for example, will very frequently fly in a V, geese will fly in a V, but it's not, I wouldn't say we can necessarily identify more than that. We might be able to identify, you might struggle, for example, to know whether they're cranes or geese, just from if they were a bit distant. You can obviously tell if they're a bit closer and you can see long legs coming out the back, then they're cranes and not geese. But yeah, so they'll fly in the Vs, typically, cranes and geese, but they're not necessarily one nice V. There might be one here with another one overlapping here, and so, but that sort of pattern schemes of geese or cranes. Otherwise, the small raptors, we'll talk about the raptors that are using thermals, so your honey buzzards and eagles. Steppe eagle will be one. Steppe eagle has quite a big migration in the western Himalayas that has been studied a little bit. there was a Dutch guy who lived in Dharamsala a few years ago, a guy called Jan Willem den Besten, and he lived there. And he watched one autumn. He spent many days watching steppe eagles, and I think he saw something like 8,000 or 9,000 steppe eagles in the 6 weeks, whatever that he was watching. But birds like that, you can identify from so they're going to take a thermal. So they're in their flocks, they're sort of circling around, grabbing the thermal, going up higher and higher until they get to a point where they then just peel off the thermal and just end up gliding through. So again, from a distance, you know, you're talking raptors, eagles, buzzards, big raptors that way. Most of the waders will flock, so flocks of birds, so you can see the sort of typical flights of waders a little bit as well. And if you get used to them, not so much on migration here, but you can get used to the way a flock of ruff looks, for example, compared to a flock of Pacific golden plovers or something else. So a little bit more difficult with small birds, passerines and things, I think. So warblers and things are all a bit tricky. But for some, yes, you can.
Thank you. Chinmay, I hope you got your answers. Thank you. Yeah. So the next question is by Sandeep Kumar. He has any suggestions for books or websites to learn more about migrations?
Yeah, there's lots on the web. I'm trying to think majorly. There's a book. So there's a book I would recommend, which I've got here. I'm just going to show you. It's this particular one, Bird Migration by Dominic Cousins is the name. Now it's mostly focused on Europe. Of course, all these books are. Most of them are Europe or America they're focused on. But it's a very nicely readable one. It's explained very clearly. So that I would recommend looking at. And I bought that for a friend in India, so you can probably find that one on Amazon or other good bookshops. So that I haven't read too many. There are a couple of major ones that are very well known, but go into a lot of depth, so they're quite technical and quite scientific. But that's one I'd certainly recommend as a first start if you want to get to understand a bit more. Websites wise, I mean, I looked at quite a lot of websites for small articles. In general, if you're interested in a particular species, then certainly Google that, because there are studies done on many species here. So a lot of these maps that I did, or I picked a species, you can find an article or a paper that's been done on this particular species. Otherwise, I didn't find any particular websites that cover migration as a whole. There'll be a few that give you a brief introduction, but yeah, if a species interests you, then certainly look for that. So the northern wheatear would be a good example that I was interested, having found that bird in Karnataka. I was particularly interested then, and then found details of the tracking studies, and it just got more and more fascinating. So a lot of species, your bar-headed geese, all the cranes have been well covered with papers, so it's worth just looking specifically for papers on those.
So the next question is by Kingshuk Selansker, and he asks, are there any latitudinal migrants in India? Umesh had answered saying Indian pitta is one. So any other species would you like to point out?
Yeah, I mean, well, I suppose spot-winged starling was a really great example of something that it is almost completely latitudinal.
Yes.
Otherwise, I don't know so many. I mean, trying to think there might be. See, what there could be in some places would be birds that migrate from land to the coast. So this happens a bit where feeding might be better on coast. The coasts are a bit milder. So I'm not sure whether really we see that in India, but you see it in other places quite a bit, where birds might go latitudinally because they're heading to the coast, because the habitat and the feeding there is better and the weather is better there. So shorter distance to the coasts might be the case with some species. Otherwise, it's quite I mean, there may well be other Himalayan species, populations of even these achydrongos, for example. Maybe they go along the Himalayas and don't go very far south in India, but might go more east, maybe. I don't know, actually. No, of any other examples, particularly.
So,
But quite a few of the species we did look at, of course, were more of a southeast migration, because they're going from Europe to the subcontinent. So those were they're longitudinal, but they were also latitudinal.
Yeah. Thank you. So the next question is by Geetanjali. And what is the percentage of decline in migration to India? And any specific reasons have been identified for the decline, if there is one?
I don't think we'd be able. I don't think anyone would be able to really tell you the potential decline on many species, but in terms of actual numbers. But what would be worth looking at is the State of India's Birds report that you hopefully have heard about. But that was published earlier this year through a consortium of organisations. So Bird Count India were involved, BNHS, WII, etc. But what that did was try to use eBird data over the last few recent years, but as well as going back sort of 20, 30 years, to see if we could work out if there were population trends. Were birds declining or were birds increasing for most Indian species? It did about 800 and something Indian species. Because we're not in the luxury that they are in the US and in Europe of having had consistent surveys running for decades. And that's the difficult thing of really detecting trends. You need to have long-term, consistent surveys. It's just, we haven't had the number of bird watchers. We have an enormous country, which is difficult to access lots of it. So it's very logistically difficult. But eBird data can be used a bit. And so it's not perfect, but actually it was quite remarkable, some of the trends they came up with. So there's not so much migrants, but I mean, if you look at the vulture trend that we know very well, the eBird modelling for that also modelled it very, very accurately. So there was some faith that when they look at other species, just looking at eBird data, you can tell trends. Shorebirds, you can tell a little bit more. They've been sort of counted a little bit through things like the Asian waterbird count. And we know from East Asian studies a lot of major declines in most of the shorebirds. And again, this came out in a lot of the State of India's Birds report. So have a look at stateofindiyasbirds.in because there are maps and a sort of one-page summary with a chart showing long-term declines and things like that of most Indian birds. So that's probably the best place to look at how birds are faring. And it'll talk briefly whether some of these birds are migrants or not.
Thanks. I mean, just to add on to this, Gitanjali, if you want to know about AP and Telangana specific, I think Humayun Tahir would be ideal person as well to answer that question because he has been doing AWC, especially migration. He's been for waterfowls. He's been doing for a long time now. So I think, yeah, he would be the ideal guy for AP and Telangana.
We'll take it offline.
Yeah. That's right.
As Mike said, that needs another whole new webinar.
Yes.
That's right. We're getting more here.
Yeah. So moving on, next question actually is by Umesh Mani. So his question is when a cuckoo, being a brood parasite, lays its egg in the nest of a host bird that is not itself a migrant, how does the young one know how to do the return migration?
Yeah, it's pretty. This is, I think, particularly remarkable when you think that, that young bird is going to make that journey for the first time ever, like all young birds do, but it's also not ever met its parent. So whatever learning there might be, so obviously something like geese, which obviously migrate in family parties quite often, it's easy for them. But even birds that don't migrate together, you think, well, at least most birds of parent and young have been together, so maybe there is some kind of learning or passing on there. But clearly in this case there isn't, and clearly it has to be something instinctive in there that it knows. I know for the surveys, the studies I mentioned of like cage birds, for example, where they were able to orient themselves at the right time of year in the right direction. So there is an instinct in there. And when it was done with this garden warbler surveys, it was hand-reared birds. So they were in a similar situation, they've never met their parents. So clearly a lot of it is instinct. And then in your cuckoo's case, I mean, it all has to be instinct. And then presumably some clever navigation, like using the magnetic fields and things like that to get to their wintry areas. But it is remarkable.
But it would actually have to be born in with that, I think, Mike, because from what you've been saying, it has to prepare itself for the migration. So it knows that somewhere along the line it's going to have to start moving. So starting to prepare itself. So it's practically knowledge coming from the egg itself, I would say.
Genetic.
Yeah, it would be. So that's what, but that's what they're talking about, where they say that things like the bird's annual cycles, so when to molt and when to migrate and things like that, are all instinctive. So that it's all those things are in there in genetic, in the genes somewhere.
Yeah.
Coded, something. Yeah.
Also, is it the same case even with? When we were many times we discussed about the pied-crested cuckoo, or the pied cuckoo being a resident population. Is it because it doesn't have the navigational skills, or is it
No, I don't know.
altogether a
I mean,
different?
yeah, I don't know how they necessarily evolved to populations. That would be an interesting one in particular. But yeah, connecting with the earlier question, whether some birds don't have the ability to do this or not, I don't know. I also don't know. I don't know if we know enough about resident pied cuckoos. Like, are they actually resident, or are they still migrants, but they're wintering in different parts of India? Some are wintering going across to Africa. Some are wintering in parts of India. Are they actually properly resident?
Yeah.
I don't know. Do you in any parts of India can you go and find a pied cuckoo in every month of the year?
No.
I don't know.
Yeah,
So obviously, in fact, there's a tagging survey started with pied cuckoos I read recently in India. So some of these migrant pied cuckoos are being tagged. But yeah, it would be interesting to know if you could find some of the resident ones and tag them. Do they actually go anywhere?
Yeah, I think yes. That's altogether again a different topic. A very big topic, actually. Yeah.
It's
So
fascinating something.
yes. So the next question again, we'll come down to the last couple of questions. Do some birds migrate only above or along long rivers and only prefer mountains?
Sorry, I missed the first bit of that. Do some birds?
Do some birds migrate only above or along rivers and some only prefer mountains? I mean, is there a differentiation that these birds do only along the rivers and some do only above the mountains or over the mountains?
I don't know. I mean, there's certainly birds using geographic features. Whether some birds would use mountains and not the rivers or not, I really wouldn't know. I don't know. I would imagine that if they would use various geographic features, so birds that have come through the mountains or through the valleys, when they come through the mountains, they're using valleys typically anyway. So whether they then follow rivers when they come into the plains, for example, I don't know.
Yeah. And actually, just two more questions, Mike. Thank you so much for answering. There is a lot of appreciation on the chat as well for you. And
I haven't looked at what questions there are, but if there are some we don't get around to, you can email them and I'll try and answer them by email anyway.
Yeah.
Yes. So
Most of my
there
answers
was
are
one of the
difficult.
so one of the question is from Yella Prakash. So he would like to ask something about Amur falcons. So please go ahead.
Yeah. Good evening, Mike. See, we had a talk by one of the speakers a few weeks back, in which that speaker mentioned that the Amur falcons, when they migrate from India to the Eastern Africa and to the Southern Africa, they are fed by the dragonflies en route, over the ocean. Can you please corroborate on this? And did anybody do any weight checks prior to and after the migration of these Amur falcons?
I don't know, but yes, it's known that the Amur falcon migration sort of follows I don't know what the proper name for it is. I think it's the wandering glider, isn't it? The dragonfly that migrates from India to Africa as well. Yeah. And they do seem to time it for that so that they've got food en route.
Yeah.
But then also, if you think the birds that are staging in Nagaland, in Doyang and the reservoir there, they're feeding on termites mainly.
Yeah.
As far as I know. So they're presumably, that's where they're staging. So they're staying there for a few weeks. So they're presumably managing to put on a fair bit of fuel through the termites that they eat there. But then they're also, they're an active flyer. They feed on the wing. They feed majorly on dragonflies. So they're getting food on their route. So it seems to be a matter of probably of staging a bit, building up some supplies on the termites because it's there, because the food's there. But they don't have quite the same issue because they're timing their migration to follow their en route prey, if you like. Whether people have, weighed them, I'm sure they have. They've trapped some birds. Obviously, there's lots of birds trapped in Nagaland, but they've tagged a few birds they've trapped there, so would have weighed them. But I don't know whether there's been anything else when they've left Nagaland, when they've been picked up in South Africa, for example. But they're slightly different from the likes of our Barto Godwit and things that put on all their fat and then fly in one long journey because they feed on the way. So that's where the timing with the dragonflies comes in. It would be like swallows and swifts and things that feed on the way. So they don't have the same need to build up the same fat supplies because they'll feed en route.
So nice. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mike. Thanks. That was interesting. But just down to the final question. This is actually one is, how do they manage bad weather during the migration? This is by Samuel sir. And also during the migration, is there any information on epidemics, but during the bird migration?
Okay. Yes, bad weather. I mean, bad weather can be a major problem. Obviously, birds tend to, when they set off for migration, although it tends to be that it's sort of their instincts and their restlessness I talked about is getting them ready to migrate. They certainly use weather as like the final trigger, so that they'll make sure they've got favourable winds. They're not flying into a really strong headwind, for example. But weather will clearly impact them. If you've got sudden belts of rain, sudden low cloud, depending on the species, it might ground them for a while, so they'll stop somewhere. So if you're, this is where, I don't know where in India we really get this quite to the same extent, but in places in North America, in UK, gets quite a lot of them. You get what's called a fall, or a fallout, it's sometimes referred to, where weather conditions have been such that a lot of birds have been grounded. So these are birds that would have continued flying over. We wouldn't have known about them because they're going too high. They're going through the night, for example. But if there's a lot of rain, low cloud in the night, late in the night, early morning, that will often bring birds down, and so they'll stop. And so you get this fall where you can have hundreds or thousands of birds, sometimes of migrants, that are just grounded somewhere. You've probably seen pictures of film where you get birds on oil rigs or on ships, for example. Similar thing might have happened. Bad weather's forced them to halt somewhere. What I would, if I can send it around as a link to pass it on if you like, but there was something I included when I did a similar presentation of the Delhi bird, something I included which didn't include here, but there was in eastern Canada in May, there was a major fall of warblers in particular, partly because of bad weather, but it's record numbers of warblers recorded. And it was one of the guys who actually works for eBird or for Cornell in New York. And so there's an eBird checklist there, which is just, it's mouth-watering. It's listing multiple species of warblers in the tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands, something like 700,000 migrant birds or something in one checklist. And there's a bit of a video of it as well. So bad weather can cause these sudden falls where birds would have been passing through but haven't done. And then that can be an issue, because if they need to stop for long and they can't feed well, that can be a major problem. The bad weather can cause them to go completely off route, which is why you'll find vagrants turning up with regularity sometimes, because like our cyclones, for example, that we get, which can be fairly predictable in timings, you always know that you're going to get a few birds caught up in them. Now, that might be pelagic birds being caught up. It can also be migrants. So they're probably, if a cyclone happened now, for example, undoubtedly it would be a time when there's small birds migrating. And so they might well be forced to land somewhere or blown somewhere out of where you'd expect to find them. So bad weather can certainly impact them. I mean, things like heavy rain and things doesn't necessarily matter. I mean, which is why in India we're not very good at going out to bird in the rain. I think people, if it's raining, you stay at home. But if you come from the UK where it rains all the time, you'd never go out birding. So I've often been out birding in the rain, and actually in certain times of year you get the most spectacular birding in the rain. You get seabirds that maybe are pushed close to land, so you can watch flocks of terns and waders and like proper seabirds, shearwaters and petrels sometimes, that are now close to land because they've been forced close to land because of bad weather over the sea. I mentioned this early morning, like cloud and rain. So sometimes what that means is the birds that are migrating overnight forced down lower. So in the early mornings, you can see these birds migrating through. They're forced down low, and they're migration through the night. They haven't stopped yet. They keep going. So bad weather actually can help. And I know a lot of birds will also fly into a wind. I think sometimes if it's not too strong, flying into a wind is better. It's better than having a strong wind behind you. Probably because if you've got a strong wind behind, it can sort of push you off course a little bit, gets your feathers pushed the wrong way. But flying into a light wind can actually be helpful sometimes.
Yep.
Yeah.
Actually, the Dungeness Bird Observatory used to be one of my favorite places when I was in UK.
Which one?
Dungeness Observatory.
Yes. Okay. Yeah. Lovely.
Lovely place for bird watching, especially for the coastal birds.
Absolutely.
And
Yeah.
it used to be a feast during monsoon. I would say whenever it rains over there, we used to have fun over there.
The English year-round monsoon, you mean?
Yeah. It's a year-round thing there.
Yeah.
The South Coast is notorious too. I was in Devon for a long, long time.
Yeah, you're a cricketer there, sir.
Yeah.
But you mentioned, that Dungeness is a bird observatory, and these are like fantastic places for studying migration. If you visit a bird
Any more
observatory,
questions, Shrikant?
No. He was going on. Please go ahead, Mike.
so yeah, if you get a chance to visit the bird observatories where they're ringing birds constantly throughout migration period. Most of what we know about migration is from ringing studies. It's only really in the last few years we've been able to do tagging studies, and so we know a bit about them there. But things like how birds build up fat and things like that is examining birds that have been caught for ringing, recoveries where birds are coming from and going to. Obviously, all this information we've got from ringing studies, really. But some of the bird observatories, it would be great if we had a few permanent birds observatories in this country. But there, whether they're ringing all year round, they're great for if you want to go even as a fairly novice birder. They're usually very welcoming, so you can see some of the ringing in action, and they're brilliant places. If you time that on a day when the time of year is right, the birds have set off, and then the weather conditions might bring some birds down, you can get one of these falls, and it can be fantastic.
That is true, absolutely. And the people over there are so welcoming that they make you feel home. Yeah. So thank you so much, Mike. I think that's the end of the questions.
You're very welcome. I went longer than I planned to. I tried to keep it down, but it was difficult. It's difficult to.
No, we didn't want to. It was so interesting that we didn't look at the time at all. But I think it's time that we look at the time now. So thank you so much, Mike. It was indeed a great pleasure. I'm sorry. Humayun Bhai, I would ask you to please give the word of thanks. Over to you.
Thanks, Shrikant. I think we can all agree, Mike, thanks so much. That was a very princely presentation.
Thank you very much.
And I dare say that this is a great learning for most of us. And the way you demonstrated using the online databases for sightings to map the distributions, migration patterns, frequencies. It's fascinating, absolutely fascinating, very educational as well.
It is. Actually, when I was picking up a species and looking into it, it just starts raising more questions. And you start thinking, I'll look at this, or I'll look at a different region of the country and these timings. So it would be great if people start doing a bit more of that themselves and posting whatever they find in places.
Yeah, that's what I was just thinking. The word migration is something that all birders are familiar with. Armed with the information you've presented today, we'll probably be able to understand the sightings better. But I suspect we'll also probably have a lot more questions.
Yeah, I'm sure. Yes. Yeah.
But all in all, a thoroughly enjoyable, interesting, and very informative session. Deccan Birders is immensely grateful to you for taking us through this and so patiently answering all our questions and queries on the mysteries of bird migration. Thank you very much, Mike.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a nice evening then.
And to you, everybody. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thanks very much.
Before we close, just to remind you people, we are meeting on Saturday this weekend, not on Sunday, and we have Richard Grimmett.
I'm looking forward to that.
Looking forward to seeing you all on Saturday.
Very good.
Thanks a lot, guys. Thank you. Thanks, Mike.
Hey, thank you. Bye-bye.